Hello and welcome to Unstoppable, the podcast. This is episode number 6, and today we're getting all child's play with Dr. Vanessa Lapointe, who I have to say, so far in this series has been one of my absolute favorite. This is the one for all the parents, especially if you worry about how you're raising your kids. If you've ever yelled at your kids, smacked your kid, or if you threaten them on a daily basis to take away their toys if they don't do what they're told, this is going to be the episode for you, where I'm going to be talking to an expert about what it takes to raise your child the right way. She is actually a parenting expert and registered psychologist with over 15 years experience. She is the author of Discipline Without Damage, and she is an incredible individual, and she's one of the smartest cookies I've ever met in the area of parenting. What she actually has to say about raising your children could change everything about what you thought true parenting was. Listen up. Ladies and gentlemen, we are super excited to welcome to the podcast. Now, actually, I want to make sure I get this right. It's Dr. Vanessa Lapointe.
You got it.
Oh, goddamn. I'm glad I got that right the first time. Welcome to the podcast to talk about superhuman parenting.
I'm super excited to be here.
Oh, I'm super excited to have you. This is a very special topic to me. Reason being, I was first I'd label myself my first experience as a father when I was in my early 30s, and I was dating a girl who had a little 18-month-old girl. And I became her pretend dad from 18 months until when she was almost 5. Wow. And for years, I used to refer to Isabella as one of the greatest coaches that I've ever had, because she just taught me so much about life and discipline, that was in such contrast to how I was brought up. And for me, exploring the potential for children, especially when we consider where we are right now as a culture, as a society, at a global level, and also at a country level, there is so much potential for where we can go from here, which lies in our kids.
Yes.
So to be able to speak to an expert who can help us do that is incredible. So welcome to the show.
Thank you so much for having me.
Great to have you here. So you've been supporting children and families for more than 15 years. How did this all begin? Where did your journey when it comes to working with kids start?
When I was a teenager, I always had summer jobs running day camp programs for kids, and so worked with kids from the time I was very young.
Is that like a camp counselor kind of thing?
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
Oh my God, I've seen the movies.
I know, it's such a great time. And I always thought of those kids as my kids, and even when I left home and went off to university, they would send me letters, and we had quite a connection. And so I knew that when I launched into my professional career, that somehow, some way I would end up working with children. And what that evolved into is becoming a child psychologist.
Wow. And so did you start studying psychology before you knew you wanted to go in the direction down the childhood path?
Yes, I did. I started studying biological psychology, so really how the brain affects how we feel and what we perceive and believe to be our reality. And then after really kind of figuring the brain out, I thought how interesting to apply this to the formative developmental period, that is childhood, where the brain is literally exploding with connections.
Wow. And so was it an aha moment for you, or was it a gradual realization that on this path of study that you were taking, that you had to go down this path and work with kids?
It was a gradual realization as I went through my neuropsych studies that I really wanted to figure out how to bring this to bear on kids. Because
it was interesting, I was talking to a psychologist yesterday who specializes in sexual therapy, and she was saying how she a similar story, how she got involved in psychology, she got into her studies, and naturally she started to present papers and essays that were related to sexuality and different things. And so it just became a natural course progression for her. Is that something that happened in the early study for you? You just natively and naturally started going towards that direction?
I ended up working in an infant development lab when I was a third-year undergraduate student. And
so what's an infant development lab?
I was in the hospital as babies were born into the world, and we were looking at how their brains perceive sound information. Wow. And so they had to be under 24 hours of age in order to participate in our study.
Oh, wow.
And so looking from those very, very first moments of life on forward, how our experiences with the world around us shape how our brain forms neural connections, and how that in turn shapes how we live our lives.
So has that basically given us insight to how important those first 24 hours are in terms of what they hear?
Well, we actually know that a lot happens in terms of what they hear, but also what they feel and experience. And so one of the first questions that I will ask families who are coming in to work with me in my clinical practice is, what was the birth experience like? Because we know through birth experiences and whether or not you were able to be connected with your parents immediately upon arriving in this physical world, that actually can shape and form part of who you become later in life.
So that's interesting. So how important is it for a parent to connect? Because we look at National Geographic, right, and basically, it's what it says on the box. It's very natural. They give birth, and the first thing that the mother does is connects with its, with its infant newborn. How important is it for us as humans to be able to have those moments of connection as soon as that baby comes into this world?
We are a social species by design, and we seek human connection, not only for its own sake, because we need it to survive. And so babies know this. As they arrive in the world, they know that you're going to be their best bet. They know that their big person, the person that's welcomed them into the world, is the one that they need to find. And so they are literally, from the moment they arrive, they are looking for you. They're looking for your voice. They're looking for your smell. They're looking for your touch. They're even looking for your rhythm in terms of what they would have experienced in the womb and what they're now experiencing on the outside. And if you watch any new parent, and I'm sure that you had this experience, as soon as that baby opens their little eyes and they start to blearily look around the room because they can't see very well, what they're looking for are eyeballs.
Really?
Right? And when they find your eyes, look at your faces, I've said that too. When they find your eyes, they'll lock them like this and they'll hold that stare.
Yeah.
And something inside of you shifts to be changed forever, right? Like in that moment, you decide that you would step in front of a moving train for that child.
Absolutely. And it's amazing how Mother Nature supports us biologically to do that, because obviously when a child is born, enormous amounts of oxytocin are released in a woman's body, and also a man's body as well.
Well, when that baby's looking at you as a dad, guess what's happening in your brain?
Oh, it's like a chemical
Squirting
firestorm.
oxytocin everywhere, right? Yeah.
So, which is fantastic, because a lot of people don't realize that the more biochemically healthy a woman is, the higher amount of oxytocin in her bloodstream, and the more natural it becomes to connect to a child. So we know it's important, but I guess there are some situations where some mothers actually don't get that opportunity. Some fathers don't get. I feel very blessed. Like we had planned a home birth, but as soon as my wife's waters broke, there was meconium in the water, and we knew we had to go to hospital. So it was an interesting progression to see how we was really excited about having a home birth, and then the wind was taking out of our sails a little bit, as we went to hospital. And it was I don't think it was necessarily the longest labour. It was 26 hours. And I don't know what that's like on the scale of labour.
Longish.
Probably my wife would say it was fucking long. But for me, it probably wasn't as bad. But it was interesting just experiencing the emotions that come up for us when we went from, our hopes were pinned on a natural home birth, water birth. And we then went to the hospital. We both adapted very quickly. My wife was, probably a little bit more behind in terms of, because she was very attached to this, this natural home birth. But I felt very privileged in the fact that, although we had to have the birth induced with Syntocin and an epidural, that we were there for that moment when he came out. And exactly what you described, it was an incredibly special moment. My life changed in an instant. But for the parents that feel like that they were robbed of that, what does that mean, that the child is going to be forever scarred? Is there something that we can do in order to ensure that that we give them the best possible chance to have a healthy attachment, from that moment moving forward?
Well, the real gift of contemporary psychology is that we know that the brain's plasticity, or its openness to external influence, is alive and well across the lifespan, and never more so than in the first 25 or so years of life, but especially the first 6 to 8 years of life. And so if you've had bumps along the way, if there's been ruptures or difficulties like a separation at birth because things didn't go exactly the way as planned, there's lots of kids that will need medical intervention as soon as they arrive in the world. Moms or dads that aren't able to be in room with baby because they need medical intervention, other things that are happening that will create those separations or those ruptures. Because the brain is so open to external influence, as long as we are then parenting with connection in mind, we can actually largely undo any potential negative repercussions from that.
And that's beautiful, because I think some, I know for my wife, there was a period of time where she was, had to let go of some stuff around how attached she was around to that natural birth. But I can imagine for a woman that maybe has to have a C-section who was attached to a natural birth, like, because that was something we had to actually consider. And
which is significant change of course.
Yeah.
Sure.
So I think it's important for a lot of women and also men out there to realize that, you know, there's always more we can do, yes?
Yes.
It's not a life sentence just because of that.
The ship has never sailed.
Yeah.
You can be 89 years of age and still restructuring those neurons in your brain.
So this is going to be a big question. It's a broad question, but I'm happy to see where it goes from your response. But in your opinion, how do we help kids to grow up in the best way possible?
I think what we need to do first is recognize the key role of connection. And a lot of people will look at the relationship between parent and child, or when I start talking about how important it is that your children actually feel seen and heard by you, that it's getting a bit sort of airy-fairy or a bit psychobabbly. It's going to be time for a group hug soon, and they want out. But when we look at the neuroscience, the science of child development, and we look at what actually allows brains to grow in the way that nature intended, children need that connection. It's not that they want it, but rather that they need it. And if they don't have it, much like if you weren't feeding them or weren't watering them or weren't sheltering them, they would die because they're dependent on you to provide for that need. If they don't get their need for connection met, they will die. A human child cannot survive outside of some kind of emotional attachment to another human being. And I've treated children in my practice for whom medically nothing is wrong. They've been diagnosed, of course, with everything in the book. Medically nothing's wrong. What is wrong is that they've been robbed of every attachment or connection that they've ever known. And so their bodies, their brains have taken a look around and thought, not tenable, I'm out. Right? And the physical systems start to shut down. They will die without intervention.
Which I think is called failure to thrive, is that right?
It's a form of failure to thrive.
Because I remember when I first started doing my research into parenting, this is over a decade ago now, and I researched, it was a book that was written where they described how there was one of the world wars where an occupying force went into a territory and they confiscated all the babies and they put them into these baby farms, and they had a nurse that would essentially go around every few hours and just try and put a bottle in their mouth because their goal was to breed soldiers. And you know what they discovered was these babies died en masse. You know, and that's where I believe failure to thrive, you know, has since been researched and studied around. But what was interesting was understanding the importance of that connection at a vital level. It's critical for survival. But I've also recognized it's not necessarily something, and I do want to go back to connection and identify what that is. But I also think it's important for us to look at, is this connection something that we don't lose? Is it something that as adults we fundamentally desire? And because when we're a child, if we don't get that connection, there's a huge possibility we could die. But then as we start to become more independent, you know, as small children, then adolescents, and then young adults, some people carry this unhealthy desire for connection to a level where it almost becomes like a drug, and if they don't get it, it can become psychologically damaging for them. So how do we provide a level of connection that will produce a healthy child, but it won't be so much where it could perhaps produce unhealthy levels of desire for connection that could perhaps end in things like codependence?
You're using this really beautiful language of how do we provide a level of connection, which actually guides us to the answer. And so as we form relationships with our growing children, the level of the connection deepens and deepens and deepens. And if everything plays out the way nature intended, by the 6th year of life, you will have arrived at the deepest root, the deepest level of connection, the deepest place of being known and understood by your primary care providers. So if that can happen, what will happen for the child emotionally is that they develop a real sense of self, that they can be with others without losing themselves in other. And so then you can imagine what that translates into when you grow up and become an adult and you're again in relationship with other humans, be them romantic relationships, professional relationships, friendships. You're in relationship with them with a real sense of yourself, and your needs as a child were all filled up or all met. So you don't have to whole fill by seeking from others which you didn't receive for yourself, right? And so a lot of the work that you will see parents end up doing for themselves when they begin to grow up their children, and it raises all of this emotion in them, is that they're actually going back and in a way reparenting themselves so that the things that they maybe didn't get as fully as they needed to have when they were wee now are met. They do it for themselves, and often in the act of parenting because they want to give the very best to their own person.
Is that healthy?
to reparent yourself?
Yeah.
Absolutely. And not only is it healthy, I would suggest that if you want to grow your child up in the best possible way, where you must begin is with yourself.
Right. Okay, so let's explore connection. Like, it's such an powerful word that, I'm sure if we had 30 people in this room right now and we all got them to write down the definition of what connection is or how they would connect with another human being, we'd probably get maybe 20 or 25 different answers.
Yes.
So in the context of the early child, the early infancy, and we talk about the importance of the critical nature of that connection, what is connection?
So if we're going to describe it globally, I would say that connection is really being seen and heard by the person with whom you're interacting. When we apply that to very young children, the way they feel, see and heard is going to be different from a 42-year-old or a 57-year-old or an 89-year-old, right? And so how an infant feels seen and heard is by being able to be in connection with their big people via the senses. And that's why we hold our babies. We know now not to let them cry things out, that we must keep them close to us, and we shush in their ear when they're crying, and we let them smell us, and we let them taste us. And so they're really connecting to us in a very sort of physical way. When they progress into the second year of life, they like to connect with us a little bit more relationally. And so that we sometimes call this stage the samesies stage. I have 2 boys at home, and I remember this stage very well because our eldest son, who will be horrified if he knows one day that I've told this story, walked in on me showering one day and realized that I didn't have a penis in the same way that he has a penis. And he was devastated. Like, he was like, what happened to it? Where did it go? Did it fall off? Like, how could you be so different from me when this is the way that I'm connecting to you? Like, I need to do the same as you.
Yeah.
And so, and then a day or 2 later, he walked in on his dad having a shower. And I remember his little feet running down the stairs and flying into the kitchen, and he's like, Mom, Daddy's got a penis. And I was like, yeah, I know. So samesies, the second year of life.
Right.
And then as we progress into the third year of life, we really like to have a sense of belonging and significance. And so you'll see, if you have a 3-year-old and then you have another baby, that 3-year-old is going to be the most territorial 3-year-old you've ever seen in the history of time, because that's how they connect, through belonging and significance.
Right.
And then as we move on, kids want to really be cherished. They want to feel like you get them, and that's the stage when they're going to bring you their art pictures like 37 times a day to ooh and ah over, because they want to know they matter.
Look at me.
I'm here and I'm cool, and I want you to think that about me. And then by 5th year of life, they become familiar with the feeling of love. And it's not till the 5th year where we've laid all of this foundation that they actually will feel what we would identify as adults as love.
And it's pure, isn't it?
It's so pure, and it's so light, and it's so poetry that's as yet untarnished by our ego and all of the wounds that we'll experience. Absolutely. Socialization.
So it was interesting, like, I'm very grateful for the journey that my ex-wife and I had on not just through the pregnancy and the birth, and we took the attachment parenting route, which I found really fascinating because, the story goes, when we were primates, we were on all fours. We had a 12-month gestation period, and then when we stood up on 2 legs, it provided a lot more downward pressure, and it ended up rolling back 3 months. And so when we're born, we're actually based on our, and I hope I get this the right way, but based on our biology, we're almost 3 months premature.
Right.
And so the attachment parenting is very much based on, a lot of skin on skin, and essentially recreating that womb-like environment for that next 3 months.
Kangaroo care.
Exactly. How important is that in the first 3 months, in your opinion, based on what you've seen?
It's essential. What I tell all of my new parents is that every baby's cry is an emergency, that they need to be close to you. You're literally, as you hold them and have them skin on skin, and they taste you and smell you and feel you around them and have the rhythm of your body and the feel of your heartbeat and all of those things around, you are co-regulating them. And as that happens, it's like it's soaking in through their skin and soaking into their neurons and literally sculpting the neurological pathways that will then become a part of how they understand their social world.
Wow.
So imagine holding your baby and really being in deep connection for, especially those first 3 months, but even longer than that, to just really be there, to really actually encourage dependence rather than independence.
That's interesting. So we want to encourage dependence in that early stage.
It is through the gift of allowing your children to be deeply dependent upon you that they will eventually emerge the other side fully independent as human beings. If you force the independence too early, you rob them of the opportunity to truly mature and become independent. They'll forever be hungry for it.
And is that where perhaps trust issues can start because they never fully had someone to depend upon? And
That's right. That's right.
Wow.
And so you start to see the pulling back and the numbing out and the tuning out as a self-preservation technique.
I am so grateful that we did that because my son now, he's 3 years, 8 months and 3 years, 9 months and a day. And I only know this because I just wrote a Father's Day article, so I had to count it all up.
Like you're still tracking the days.
But only just because I just wrote an article about it. But one of my favorite practices with my son it's called belly to belly, and I called it belly to belly transfer. And it started with me just pulling my shirt up. He'll pull his shirt up. We'll touch our bellies together, and I'll give a little bump, and then I'll provide him a healing. And over the last 9 months, it's evolved into this game where in the mornings now, like he'll come into he'll wake up, I'll go in and I'll go, what do you want to do? He'll go, I want to chase feet. And so we'll go into my bedroom. And sometimes it's crazy. He'll even do this in the middle of the day or even in the evenings. He'll go, okay, Daddy, let's do chasing feet. He'll pull me into the bedroom. He'll close all the doors, all the windows, get me to turn out all the lights. And then he'll say, Daddy, take your clothes off. And I know how weird this sounds, right?
You carry on.
And he'll get me to take his clothes off down to his nappy or his undies, and I'll take my clothes off down to my boxer shorts. We'll jump into bed and we'll just literally roll all over each other. He will get on top of me. You know when you see a dog in a park and it finds like a dead bird or a piece of shit and it just rolls in it? He will just roll all over me and into me, and it's just this magic magnetic attraction that just almost combusts into this this world of physiological fireworks.
Yes.
At what age does that become inappropriate?
Oh, you'll know.
Right.
And the thing is that you don't need an expert or anybody to script it for you, because there'll be a natural sort of
separation,
shifting of the game that will become something different as they grow older. Lots of times parents will ask me, well, how do I know when I shouldn't change in front of my kid or use the bathroom in front of my kid?
You just know.
You'll know.
Yeah.
Because you'll get a spidey sense about it. It'll start to feel kind of like different, and they'll naturally sort of pull away and you'll naturally pull away. And that's the thing, we have so much intuition built into our wiring about how to do this, so you'll know. The beautiful thing about that game, you described it as physiological fireworks. And also there's this wonderful dance happening when you're in that kind of roughhouse play, sort of, where they're figuring out the give and take and the back and forth of relationship.
That makes sense.
Right?
Yeah.
And I know in terms of like proprioceptive understanding of self and other and where our bodies are in space, roughhouse play is actually a really important part of even that part of our neurological system. So like check mark, and check mark.
Oh wow! So I'm passing the parenting test so far.
You're winning.
Oh right, I am winning. This is so cool. This is just okay. So you mentioned co-regulating, co-regulating. Because the question I was going to actually ask you is, how important is it for us as big humans to teach them how to regulate as little humans? Because one of the things I've learned in my own journey through my own therapy and my own development and growth is the importance of learning how to regulate emotions. And I almost feel like I only learned how to do that in the last 20 years of my life. I don't feel like I actually grew up learning how to regulate some of the intense emotions that come up, which in many cases triggered levels of anxiety that I didn't know how to deal with either.
Sure.
So with kids and with this goal of raising healthy children, you mentioned that the skin on skin is a great way to initiate the process of just intuitively teaching them how to co-regulate, because they're tuning into the environment of the parent's body. But at some point, as those kids become more mature and you reach that different stage where there's perhaps less skin on skin, what role do we play, and how do we play that role of demonstrating or modeling the regulation that's required in order to become a healthy human being?
So it is essential for parents to do that for children for the first several years of life. And the reason is, it's interesting, we hear very early on, babies need to learn to self-soothe to sleep. right?
Yeah.
Which I always just think, do we all understand that that's not even a thing? Like babies don't self-soothe. They can't. They don't have the neurological wiring to do it. They're literally seeking it from the world outside. The only reason that babies will fall asleep when you're sleep training them using an extinction method, which is basically the cry it out method, is that they literally become so traumatized by the experience of being so alone when they're so frightened that they dissociate and their brains turn off. And we're like, oh, terrific, they went to sleep, it's working.
Oh my God.
Yes. And so that's because they're not being co-regulated.
Right.
And so children actually can't be taught how to regulate their bodies. They must experience co-regulation, and via the world of neuroplasticity, then come into the capacity to regulate self, to manage impulses and all of those kinds of things. And so as a young child fires up and gets dysregulated because they're frustrated or sad or mad or something's happened, and so all of the downstairs brain, which is where all the wiring is housed, that's going to kind of, you got it, and then we've got our thinking brain on top, right? This is the cortex.
Right.
And so we often talk about when the downstairs brain gets all rumbly, fired up, we flip our lid. So the thinking brain now no longer exists.
Yeah.
And yet what do we do to our little kids? Use your words.
Wow.
Tell me what you want, right? That part is not even online right now. There's nothing there. They're all downstairs because they don't have the capacity to self-regulate until they've amassed enough experiences that we've literally scripted for those neurons how to wire themselves up so they become good at self-regulation. So as your little one gets fired up, when you swoop in alongside as a big person and co-regulate by offering empathic understanding and connection and all of those kinds of things, you'll settle them back down. We now, through the act of connecting emotionally with children, it's the opposite of being dysregulated. It is what brings children back down to a space of being regulated.
Wow.
And then practice that. I don't know, you got 3-year-olds, so how many times a day does that go down?
Well, and it's interesting what we're taught in mainstream society. Like when a child cries, we're even told, like you said, let them self-soothe. And what you're suggesting is the healthiest thing we can do for a child when they're crying is actually hold them.
Absolutely.
But I guess at what point does us holding them, or at how important is our mental state when we hold them to ensure that we are teaching a healthy co-regulating practice?
And so that's why it's so important that parents look into themselves and make sure they've done their own work in the act of becoming the best parent that they can be for their child to grow up in the best possible way. Because if you're perpetually in a dysregulated state, if you're anxious, if your child's blow-ups are triggering in you, know, this state of alarm, and now you're like, no, we're good, like everything's fine, I'm gonna co-regulate you. Kids, because they haven't been socialized like we have as adults, they'll just like sniff you from a mile away and they'll be like, yeah, like that's happening. and nobody's regulated. Now we're all just, in an iterative way, creating all sorts of storms of dysregulation. Can
that be even more destructive than no co-regulation at all? Like let's say you've got a parent that's their child is having a meltdown, their lid is flipped, they're going, well, I was told that I must hug my child and I'm fucking pissed off, I'm losing my own shit right now. I'll hug them, calm down, calm down, calm down. Like at what point does that become destructive, potentially?
Yeah. So the advice that I would give parents around that piece is that if you feel like you're going to harm your child,
we're talking physically? Okay.
You need to walk away.
Yeah.
If you're in it and you can feel yourself going, so you're going to start shouting or being sort of the angry, yelly parent, try to find a way to exit gracefully, stage left. Where you're like, you know what, sweetie? I just remembered I have to call grandma. I'm coming right back.
Right.
And then go and take some deep breaths, get yourself pulled together, and come back online so that you can reconnect in a way that's going to be maybe a little bit more helpful. Because you'll have to undo it.
Yeah.
If you lose it on your child, you are going to have to circle back around, undo that. We've robbed them now of an opportunity for co-regulation, and then we have to kind of pick up the pieces. Not that you wreck them.
Yeah.
Like, I'm a child psychologist, and if you think it's fabulous in my house every day, think again. But that you'll have to come back around to it. So the less that we end up in those circumstances, the better.
One of the things I find really interesting as an observation is what seems like the overwhelming disability for parents to take responsibility when they make a mistake in front of their child and actually own it in front of their child and even apologize. Is that something you see on a regular basis? And if it is, how do we approach personal responsibility with our kids in a way that doesn't feel like, because I know for some parents, I'm assuming here that they might feel like they lose their power, but I know for me personally, like when I do something that's, if I accidentally raise, and my son Noah, he's really good. Like if I raise my voice, he'll put his hand in his ear and go, "Daddy, that's too loud."
Yeah.
And I'll just like, I'll crouch down at his level. I'll look him in the eye and say, "Sorry, buddy. I raised my voice. I know I shouldn't have. I didn't mean to do that." And the response I get from him is so sweet. Like he'll say, "It's okay, Dad. You know, I understand," or something incredible like that. But what I'm curious to know is how important is it for us as parents to set that example of personal responsibility when we perhaps act out in a way that we become conscious of in that moment isn't appropriate. It's not a great demonstration of healthy behaviours. How do we approach that as a parent?
I think part of the challenge is that we confuse role with relationship. And so in parenting our children, we get really tied to this idea of what is our role. Our role is to be in charge. Our role is to be the one in the lead. Our role is to show our child. Our role is to provide guidance. Like we get sort of really locked down in what that is, when really, like you could biologically be the dad or the mom, and that could biologically be your role, but you haven't earned your space in the relationship. Right? And so then when we think about relationship, where it's not this like, this kind of oogie sort of power that you're bringing to bear on the situation, which then would have you defending and not wanting to admit that you were less than, or that you fell down, or that you made a mistake, right? If we get out of that kind of power, instead walk into a space of nurturing power, the sort of power that has our child knowing we are their best bet. And even if they don't always agree with us, even if they don't always love the boundary that we've set or the rule that we've held in place, that they will know we've got their back and we're picking up what they're putting down, and we understand them as a result of being their big person. And so when you're in that kind of a space around what is the power dynamic in the parent-child relationship, and you know that relationship is the epicenter of how nature is going to allow this child to grow as intended, you will seek to atone. You will seek to own your wrong, and you will do it in a way that has you beautifully in the lead in terms of scripting for them how that looks.
Wow. That
we all make mistakes.
Yeah.
That it happens. I was the super yelly, shouty mom this morning. I am so sorry. And that's done now, sweetie.
Yeah.
I'm really looking forward to, and then the next point of connection.
Wow, that's beautiful. So how different are our brains fundamentally? You know, when we talk about the adult brain, you know, at full maturity, which is in most cases what the parent's brain looks like. And then you have you've got the infant brain, you've got the toddler brain. When we look at the infant / say toddler brain, what are the key differences that as parents we need to be aware of that will help us understand the different types of communication that we need to be using when we're communicating either with an infant or with a toddler?
I love this question. So the brain basically is going to wire up from the bottom up. Right? And we just talked about downstairs brain and upstairs brain. And this is where it's sort of our traditional understanding of IQ or intelligence, all of that's upstairs brain stuff. Downstairs brain stuff is emotional brain. And if the brain is growing from the bottom up, so in the first years of life, it's really this part of the brain that's most actively in development, most importantly in development. We want to be able to connect with that. We want to know why it's so important that we are in right relationship and in attachment, in connection with our young children, that we are fostering dependence, that we are welcoming them into the fold, that we're inviting them to lean on us so that they don't have to be in this dysregulated state of survival, that we can really get those neurons all wired up in the best possible way. And then what will happen is the cortical layers will really start to develop. And the cortex develops in a wave-like pattern in terms of thickening, which we'll use as a proxy for maturation, from the base of the brain at the back here, pushing forward to the front. And it isn't until we see a really juicy frontal and prefrontal cortical development that we will see kids fully coming online in terms of...
What age do we see that?
Yeah, so on average, maximal thickness of the cortical layers up front will be around age 10.
Right.
But we have some variation. We know, for example, in the population of children that are diagnosed as attention deficit, if they genuinely have attentional regulation challenges, they are on average 3 to 5 years delayed in that frontal thickening. And so there can be some variation, but that they do eventually catch up, which is actually really key and interesting. And so as we think through that, we know that you have, for example, no capacity to blend emotion until you've got frontal lobe functioning fully on board. And you won't see the first glimmers of that until your child's roughly about age 7.
Wow.
And so we ask little children, ages 4 and 5, to share.
And for them, that's just a foreign concept.
Like, I really, really, really want to play with this toy. That's feeling 1.
Yeah.
Feeling 2 is, oh shoot, if I knock my friend over and steal the toy away from them, they'll be really sad.
Right.
If you want to ask a child to share, you want to see them be independent in that, they have to have those 2 thoughts existing at the same time. And until your frontal lobe is fully online, you can't do it. So then what happens? This. And what thought reigns supreme? Well, the thought that's most serving of self, right?
Right.
And so that thought is going to be, I'm going to take the toy.
Right.
Unless there's an adult standing right there scripting it.
Yeah.
And it doesn't make them a bad child.
Yeah.
It just means that their brain is developmentally by design, rightfully so, immature.
Yeah.
Because they're 4, they're 5.
Okay, interesting.
They're not 9.
Okay, that's fascinating. You didn't mention the mammalian brain. I'm curious because obviously you said it grows from the ground up. We've got the reptilian brain, which is responsible for all our basic emotions and feeling. We've got the neocortex, which is like this super engine of problem solving, critical thinking, being able to analyze situations and blend emotions. But what about the development of the mammalian brain, which is obviously so important in that social order and that social regulation for a child? Where does that come in?
So that's going to be part of the ground up development, and I'm making it sound like they go in layers and it's really clean and succinct.
It's not, messy as hell, right?
It's messy and it's not like that at all. And so as you're developing the capacity for regulation, as you're understanding as a social species. That we have this dance, that there is reciprocity in that this is the way that all plays out. That's where you're learning and sculpting and scripting all of that out neurologically. So it's sort of happening simultaneously.
It's happening simultaneously. So it's interesting. My son naturally loves to share things like food, water, drinks, toys. It's just and it's fascinating to everyone who sees it. Like he just shares. So is that an indication of, and again, I'm not trying to make my child into some kind of super child here, but he is. But
of course he is.
Of course he is. What does that indicate when you see children like that that have those kind of, behavioral anomalies?
It could be a temperament thing, where a few things, he could be a very easygoing child who just sort of naturally comes into that. The sharing of food and the connecting around those things to me speaks more of an attachment dance. Like that's a real sort of caring routine, and if he's been really cared for beautifully that way by yourself and his mother, then you'll see him really naturally start to offer it back to you. So it's sort of like this mirror thing that begins to happen where you see coming out of your child exactly what you reflected onto him, right?
It's so true, because even this morning I said to my son, he just got his 4th dan for his white belt in jiu-jitsu.
Oh, wow.
And I just said to him, you got jiu-jitsu this afternoon, I want you to know I'm really proud of you. And he goes, oh, thanks, Dad, that's so sweet. And I was just like, oh my God, where does this kid come up with this shit? Honestly, it's amazing.
And who do you know that speaks to him that way?
That's what I say to him all the time. And it's so amazing when you hear it come back to you as a mirror, as a reflection.
Sure.
And I think sometimes as parents we forget, how much our children reflect us.
Yes.
And for me, this is one of the things that I've seen in other parents where, oftentimes one of the biggest challenges that we have in other people is not the other people, but it's the parts of ourselves that we see in them that we haven't resolved in ourselves that we don't really like. And do you think that for some parents that some of the conflict that we have with our children is because they're perhaps exposing us to things that we've already reflected and exposed to them, and we're like, oh no, that's not who I want you to be?
Mm-hmm. So that just gave me goosebumps.
Right. Wow.
I don't just think that. I know that.
Right.
I know that. Basically, when it comes right down to doing our own work, there is no other. They're just a screen, and we just project all of our stuff onto them, right? And so if you have wounds that have not been healed, if you have hurts, if you have stuff that you're really trying to figure out, it's almost like your child's soul signed a contract to come onto this earth and be your kid, and to trigger all of that in you so you would get a chance to sort yourself out.
I love that.
What a gift.
I love that so much. I feel so blessed. Like I'm 42 now, I think. I didn't have my son, obviously, until my late 30s, and I actually feel grateful for that opportunity because I actually got so much time to work on my stuff. And I guess for people that are listening to this, like many people will maybe not have kids or will have kids. So for the people not having kids, this is obviously a great recommendation for therapy, for everyone. And I'm an advocate of therapy. I think everyone should have therapy in their life. But for perhaps those parents who are they're in the parental mode right now and they're seeing this dance come out and they're starting to go, holy shit, I don't want to fuck my kid up. Like, what advice would you give to them, if they're starting to become aware of what's being reflected back to them is actually what they're reflecting to their child?
I would say do your work. That this isn't about your child, this is about you. And that it's time to go inside and figure out what it is that you're vomiting up all over them, that's coming back. And in doing that, to know your innocence in that. Like you didn't ask for that. I have yet to meet, I have worked with parents in the social, like the child protection system who, through the eyes of society, have done horrible things to their children. And I have yet to meet a parent who desired that, who set out on their life path to do that to their kids, right? And so to know your innocence in that you're just a human being. You are somebody who's trying to find their way in the face of obviously some challenges. And those challenges now are presenting very concretely in your role as a parent to your child. And so lucky you get a chance.
Because I think too many parents, and again, this is opinion, so I'm probably maybe judging here, from what I've seen, they try to treat the child when the problem isn't the child. It's like Cesar Millan. Have you heard of Cesar Millan, the dog trainer? I love his work. And what I love about his philosophy is, I rehabilitate dogs and I train humans. He said, because the problem's not the dog, the problem is what the dog is reflecting from the human.
That's right.
And I see that in children. Like I absolutely see that in children. The question I have is, when it comes to developing our child, some parents obviously take a disassociated approach and they go, well, I'm going to work on the child. I'm not going to work on myself. And I know this is a loaded question for a very deliberate reason. How important is us working on ourselves, and in what priority would that be when it comes to developing a healthy child? Should we be trying to work on the child and their behaviors first, or should we be putting ourselves first and working on our stuff, our shit, our baggage, in order to give us the best opportunity to work on them?
What is to the highest good of self is to the highest good of all. And so when we can work on self, that's the first priority. But it's messy because you're not going to be like, oh, pause your development, sweet child of mine.
For some parents, it's also going to be confronting because they don't want to see the problem as themselves.
Absolutely.
Like a dog owner, no, the problem's not me, the problem's the child.
That's incredibly vulnerable to have to sit with the reality that you might be the one.
Yeah.
Like this might be all you. Right? And so you have to be pretty adult and pretty mature to be able to go there. And that's not going to be the way it plays out for everybody, right? And so then we meet them exactly where they're at. And I do this in my work every day. I work with parents much more than I work with children.
Yeah.
And I know, different parents are at different places in their journey and can handle different layers of that accordingly. And so I would say starting with self is always the ideal, but it's not going to be the reality for everyone.
Yeah.
And the beautiful thing is that in the act of growing up your child, like the one that you gave life to and brought into the world, there's this really wonderful loop that begins to happen for this child, the one inside of you that still hasn't grown up. And so even without directly taking on your own work, you can begin to see that sort of play out in how you might feel compassion for yourself, how you might understand self a little bit more deeply, a little bit more lovingly than you would have before, because you'll be taken back to those places as you watch your child grow. And so, the work can play out and manifest at different levels and different layers depending on where people are at and what they can handle.
Wow, that's amazing. It's interesting I grew up in a very fringe household. My parents split up when I was 6 months old. My father was like one of the top economists in the world. My mother was a clairvoyant and a psychic, and it was like this incredible mesh. But one of the things that I would feel very grateful for that I was exposed to at a very early age was mindfulness and meditation, which has become an incredibly central part of my life and a theme in my life. But it's also become, over the years, something that's become quite popular, that's actually joining the ranks of pop psychology as in some cases a tool and a treatment and a methodology modality for treating, all kinds of, mental health issues and even just general performance issues. So from your experience, I'm curious to know, have you experimented, has this been something that's been prescribed? Have you seen, people start to adopt mindfulness and perhaps meditation and, practices around self-awareness and consciousness in a way that has been really helpful in the parenting space?
Mm-hmm. So for the first time last year, we actually ran a mindful parenting group out of our clinical space where we had parents from our community coming together every week to talk about mindfulness in parenting, and also with our kids. I mean, the literature coming out around mindfulness and neurodevelopment and how that all sort of plays out, and the world of consciousness and conscious parenting, and all of the different angles of that. We know that changes your experience, and when you change your experience, you change your brain, you change the neurological pathways underneath all of that, which then carries on to have you perceive things differently, thus changing your experience, and it's this whole iterative thing. And so, all of the programs that are geared towards mindfulness for children, mindfulness for us as adults, but then in particular, mindfulness for us as parents, absolutely seeing big results. Wow. With respect to that in my work and certainly in the research world.
Well, it's interesting because I used to meditate with my son when I had him on Skin on Skin. And it was one of the things that was really interesting is my wife, when he was an infant, found it very difficult to settle him. But I would take him, put him on Skin, I'd meditate, and I'd have him settle in a moment. And it's become almost like a bit of a theme in my relationship with my son. There was a little bit of a gap there because there's probably an 18-month period where I lost my way with regular disciplined meditation, but it's come back in a big way in the last few months especially, to the point now where, I'll meditate on his bed, because in the evenings he'll ask me to lie with him. And now what I do is I actually meditate with him, and he'll call it, can you concentrate on my bed? Can you meditate on my bed? Which he loves. But it's been interesting now to watch his interpretation and his modeling. Because it was I think it was actually Father's Day. Was that when I posted that photo? Father's Day, I was in bed and he came into my bed and we're doing the chasing feet, skin on skin, belly to belly. And I said, buddy, Daddy didn't get to do his complete meditation this morning before you woke up. Do you mind if I finish my meditation now? And he's like, okay. And I said, that just means you're going to have to be quiet for a few minutes. And I was like, okay. So I started my meditation and then he was rolling around the bed and I could hear him playing around. And all of a sudden it went really quiet. And I opened my eyes and he's sitting there with his palms in his hands like this, trying to actually, there's the photo, there's the actual photo of him meditating. And it's interesting now just to see how he is naturally orientating towards becoming quite self-aware of not just his environment, but also himself. So is self-awareness, is consciousness, is that something that we can propagate at even at age 3?
Mm-hmm. So I feel like there's 2 layers. One is the physical modeling of that, but the second and more profound layer is your child awakening to the experience of energetically being in your field as that's happening. And so when you described him as an infant on your chest while you were meditating and that you found that really settled him, think about energetically the field that you had created around him and the resonance within his little soul as he sort of landed in that field. And so now here he is at 3.5. He's soaked up neurologically, soulfully, emotionally already these experiences, not just because you modeled it, but because you allowed him to be bathed in it.
Yeah, right.
And so here he is at 3.5.
Man, it's nuts. Absolutely nuts. Is this, and again, I don't want to sound like this is all about Noah, but it is. But is this something that you're seeing is becoming quite common? Are we giving birth to a higher level of, because you've heard of blue children, or is it blue children? And the blue child, is it blue children or purple kids? I read about this movement, I think it was called Blue Children, where that there's certain philosophies that believe that the children that we're giving birth to now have high levels of consciousness than perhaps the predecessors and ourselves generations before them. Is that something that you're witnessing, or is this perhaps some people getting a little bit carried away in certain smaller cultures?
So I don't know about the blue children.
I think they're called Smurfs. I'm not sure.
However, if you think back, like generationally, rewind and think about the world that children of that time were marinating in, and the crises that were around us, and how there really was not time for navel gazing, first world problems.
Yeah.
There wasn't space for that because we were surviving. We were trying to get through world wars and depressions and other kinds of things that were really significant. And in terms of Maslow's hierarchy of needs, had us not really self-actualizing very well, right? And so fast forward to now, particularly, for your children and my children and this kind of a world that we're living in, that we're marinating them in a different reality. And that reality almost demands that you have emerged from those more kind of primitive ways of existing. And so if you rewind culturally in terms of how we would understand, tears in our young children, and there was this sense like, you got to suck it up, buttercup, like if you don't learn how to do this now, what are you going to do when it comes to being out in the big bad real world? Right? So there was this hardness around that. And so now we understand, like, our realities are very different. And if we can raise children in sort of consciousness for the world that we live in right now, that's the fit. Like, that's what makes sense. That's what resonates. And so what you're speaking of lands for me, because I do think that we are, the pendulum is swinging away from these really sort of entrenched behaviorist ways of looking at children and swinging over to this space of understanding that, it's Hollis that I think talks about sort of what we see, like the crusty outside, is but a thin wafer that rests on top of this ocean of other things. And it's in becoming conscious that we become aware of the ocean, of what all is in that we need to connect with as we grow ourselves and our children up.
Because, we hear a lot of, especially in philosophy, that children are born into a natural state of consciousness and then they basically are grown out of it.
Yeah.
Like we pound it out of them. But to me also, I think consciousness and intuition are two things that are very intrinsically linked. Obviously the more conscious we become, the more tuned in we are to our environment, the information that's present, that can be given to us.
Sure.
I'm curious to know from you, when it comes to building a healthy, conscious child, how do we support children when it comes to their intuitive capabilities that in many cases can probably, exceed their parents' capabilities, in a way that would encourage them to naturally develop it as a really useful tool that they can use in life, rather than push it down as something that they perhaps only get reintroduced to, maybe 10 or 20 years later through some form of a spiritual concept or intervention.
Yeah, when they realized how messed up they are.
How do we support children to become intuitive?
I think...
Not become, hang on. How do we support children to naturally develop what's already there?
To emerge into their full selves with that intuition on board. I think a couple of things. I think that if you are in that space yourself, then your child is going to be energetically given the opportunity to sort of be their fullest self and not have to shut down pieces of themselves because it's not socially acceptable or it's not something that's okay with the world around them. So for you as a parent to find yourself in that space so that your child will marinate in that. But the second thing is that one of our big jobs as parents is to really remove impediments, to provide the shield for the world that can be very overwhelming, very intrusive, very intense. And in protecting our children from too much wounding from the world around, too early on, we allow their full self to exist. And so part of our job as a parent is to be the shield, to be the protective buffer that steps in. And this takes us back to that idea of dependence, and really have our children resting in sort of this safe haven, this bigger womb, if you will, in the world that we've welcomed them into, while their brains and their sense of self are so developing and growing. If we can provide that protection, what we give them is the capacity to carry it on independently as they emerge into fully mature adults. So I would say those two things: be aware of your own level of consciousness, and also aware of your duty, your obligation, your most incredible responsibility to shield and protect your child from the world around.
Like, I literally feel like that was I feel like I've found two purposes in life. My first purpose was to help people, and my second purpose was to actually have a son and, have a child or be a parent, like whether it's one child or 50. What you said, it just lands, to use your language, so beautifully for me. So you're most well known for, obviously for many things. I checked you out. You're obviously very good at what you do. You've got a great reputation. But the thing that I found incredibly attractive, apart from your absolute incredible sharp mind, was your concept around discipline without damage. So what is, I know you wrote the book, you actually did write the book, Discipline Without Damage. So as a concept, before we dive into it, what is the concept of discipline without damage?
So the idea with discipline is that as parents, big people, and when I say big people, I'm referring to all the grown-ups that are growing up children. So
adult children.
Whether you're a teacher or a grandparent, an auntie, an uncle, a neighbor, a care provider, whatever your role is, when you are actively investing in the growing up of children, you're part of the crowd that I call big people. So we look at kids, particularly in the world of discipline and behavior, and we're like, that hitting, that back talking, that all of that is a no-go. And so we want to squash it. We want to make it so that it doesn't exist, because it's very inconvenient and it's loud and it's embarrassing and it's all of those kinds of things, right? What we happened into, unfortunately, over time, was that we knew without knowing the connection that we have with our children is essential to them. And so we discovered very quickly that if we put the connection on the line, we can control the behavior. And so I don't like your sassy back talk. I don't like how you just hit your brother. I don't like how you're not listening to me when I tell you to put your toys away. Go to timeout. And so what have we done? We've separated them from us. We've literally banished them. We've said, you're all that in a bag of chips, except for when you're not listening, not behaving, not doing all that. And so I'll love you unconditionally. On the condition that you do and are as I say, as pleases me. And if you don't, then you're over there. Go away. Go and sit in some timeout, or on the thinking bench, or all the other flowery names we give it to make ourselves feel better. We send them away. And so right away we'll notice they're like, and they don't like that. And so they'll cry, and they'll proximity seek. They'll call to us. They'll want us to come back and end the timeout, because they need the connection, not just because it feels good. Remember, they need it to survive, right? And so they're pretty much willing to do anything to restore the connection. Although a lot of parents will tell you, if they're using timeout as the example, over time the timeouts lose their effectiveness, because your kid's like, whatevs. Like, I'm on to
therapy. It's like
right, absolutely. So they they start to numb to it. Yeah. And so what we've done is we've recognized, unfortunately, that this connection is really essential to their development, and it is a need, like a basic need. One of the United Nations Declaration of the Rights of the Child, one of the very first principles is that every child everywhere has the right to love, and not because it feels good, but because we need it to survive. And then we decide we're going to play with it. I want you to behave, so I'm going to put that on the line. For reals, like something that's so essential to not just healthy development, like survival. And you're going to play with it? You're going to say, 32 times a day when you have a toddler or a preschool age child, and they're doing stuff that you don't want them to be doing, you're just going to put their most essential need on the line? At what cost?
Wow.
Like, that is a sacrificial play, if ever there was a sacrificial play, right? And we find that, like, when you consequence children, it's another form of disconnect, right? Because you're literally saying, oh, you really love pasta? You really wanted spaghetti for dinner? Well, guess what? You behave or that's out too. Oh, you really love bouncing on the trampoline? Do as I tell you, or you don't get to anymore. Like, separate, disconnect, separate, right? So
it's almost like, for many parents, discipline has been a process of bargaining.
Absolutely. Yeah. And manipulating.
Yeah, that's a potent word. Yeah.
And for all the parents out there right now that are like, but that's the only way I know how to do this, right?
Yeah.
And might be feeling incredible guilt around that.
Yeah.
The thing is, we were all raised by behaviorists, almost by definition, with few exceptions. We were raised by people that looked around and thought, that's not acceptable, squash, move on, right? So now we're all parents. And we're figuring it out.
Yeah, right.
And so, of course, that's how we've parented our children as, mass generations of people in the last 20, 30 years. Of course, that's how we've done it. And so not to really spend a lot of time beating ourselves up, but to know that that's not the way that it needs to be happening according to nature and the science of child development. And so really what Discipline Without Damage is all about is understanding that children are meant to misbehave. And in fact, we don't even need to call it misbehavior. They're meant to grow. And growth is messy and interesting and inconvenient and all of those kinds of things, which is exactly the way that it's supposed to be. Nobody ever said it was going to be really quiet and peaceful.
It's not what it said in the brochure, I'm sure.
I know, right?
It's interesting when you talk about, like, mainstream discipline, you refer to the bargaining and the manipulation, but you don't refer to, like, the physical discipline that, has been, quite dominant in many cultures for a long time. And I think it was about 10 years ago I shared a photo on Facebook that said, I was brought up, I was spanked as a child, and as a result I developed a condition called respect for your elders. Mm-hmm. And I shared that like 10 years ago, and I remember I copped a little bit of flack from a couple of people, and I was like, no, I stand by the fact, I was beaten as a child and I turned out all right, which is now questionable when I look at all the therapy that I've had. Mm-hmm. But then Noah comes into this world, and when I think he was about maybe 2, he was sitting on the couch and he was eating a carrot, and I looked at him, I was sitting beside him, I looked at him, and I just started to remember all the things that had been used to discipline me, like being hit with a thong, having wooden spoons broken over you, and really copping some serious beatings. And then all of a sudden I started to visualize myself doing this to Noah. I lost it. Yeah. I just broke down. Like, I was sobbing. Like, Noah's like, Daddy, are you okay? I'm fine. I'm just putting myself back together. And he's like, are you okay? Like, he was Noah. And for me, it was actually quite traumatic to now go, holy shit. Like, that's not okay. Like, that's just not okay. So how do we as, adult children or adult big people, how do we reconcile the whole, well, this is how I was brought up and I turned out all right. What's good for the goose is good for the gander.
Mm-hmm. I think when we know better, we need to do better.
Yeah.
And I'm also 42. We were brought up in a different time, and what our parents knew, and that's what they did, is very different than what we know, and that's what we need to do with our children. And one of the things about growing up is really being able to come into this space of being adaptive, of accepting the things that are not meant to be, that cannot be changed, that will not to work out, having our tears about that, having our sadness about that, and finding a way to move through. And so, and I am not a proponent of spanking or any kind of physical punishment whatsoever. Historically, where the SWAT on the bottom would have come into play was parents who were attempting to hurry up the tears, to hurry up the acceptance of the thing that cannot be changed, so that then the child can adapt and come onto the same page. Because we have these gross distortions of the power dynamic and everything that plays out, really what that looks like is parents who are hitting their their growing children who have these really, by design, immature brains that are just begging to be filled up with all of this juicy connection and safe harbor and empathy and all of that good stuff, so that they can become fully mature as adults. And when we are hitting our children, we are robbing them of those opportunities. One way that I've heard it said, there's a local psychologist here, Gordon Neufeld, who talks about how our job is to grow up children who are hardy, not hardened.
Ooh.
And we gift them that hardiness by really championing their growth when they're wee, so that they can become resilient adults. When you force a hardening, a closing down, a shutting out, and numbing out reality for a child because you just make it unbearable, are they going to be able to make it through a war? Yeah. How's that going to look in a marriage? How's that going to look when they go to parent their own children? Wow. How's that going to look when they're navigating conflict in their place of employment? Not good.
Yeah. It's not like we can go and spank our employees, right?
Truth.
Yeah. So that's interesting. So you've talked about, so spanking is quite destructive. I think it's fairly common understanding now for most people. It's only becoming mainstream now, the importance of understanding how bargaining and manipulation are going to affect the children. So how do we discipline kids in a way that is actually going to help them grow? How do we create boundaries? Should we be creating boundaries in the first place, or should we just let these little fuckers run riot and do whatever they want and work it out themselves and just be there to catch them in case they fall?
Right. So we call that flowery meadows parenting, where you just release them to the flowery meadows and watch them grow.
Oh, I like that.
It never works out. It's bad. It's not good. So the idea is that, counterthetically, I wrote a book about discipline, which is really all about, don't discipline. And then people go, what? We're just going to let the children roam free and they can do whatever the hell they want whenever they want. The reality is that we don't need to, all these ridiculous contrived strategies that we have, the timeouts and the 1, 2, 3 countdowns and the consequencing and all this stuff that we do all the time to try and control our children's behavior. All of it's outlandish, really, when you think about the science of child development. And so you can just stop doing all of that and instead think about, how do you create a reality for children that allows them to feel safe, to feel connected, and to bump into the appropriate boundaries so they figure out the social norms of the world that they live in and what's going to be kind of required of them as they kind of go forth. And I often talk with parents about, if you were think of the biggest bridge that you drive over on a regular kind of basis. And we have here in the Lower Mainland of British Columbia a bridge that's very well known and super terrifying. It's old and it's really narrow and nobody likes driving on it.
What is it? I want to go there.
Now the name of it escapes me. It's going to come to me. I'm going to let it marinate, incubate, and I'll know it by the end. And so if you were to come up on that, you want to go drive over it. That's so awesome. Okay, so you're going to be my example.
Okay.
Let's say you were coming up to this bridge, which maybe you've driven over 100 times with no real problem. Right? You've never driven off the bridge. You've never even bumped into the guardrails on the bridge. But let's say on this particular day, you drive the Patella Bridge.
Okay.
You drive up to it, and somebody has removed the guardrails from the bridge. Now, if I'm in a theater of 1,000 people presenting this talk, and I say, how many of you are still going to drive across the bridge? There's going to be 3 kookalooks that put their hands up and say, oh, I go across. Am I right? However, you have to admit, you're driving in the center lane a little more slowly than you would have had the guardrails
more cautious,
been in place. So the question then becomes, well, if we can drive across the bridge 100 plus times and never have used the guardrails, why are we so cautious? Why are we so fearful of going across the bridge if somebody's taken the guardrails off? And the answer lies in why parents need to have boundaries, rules, norms, expectations for their children, because the kids actually want that to exist. They want to know the safety of the guardrail is in place, so that if they bump into it, it'll contain them.
Right.
It'll hold them in place so that they can kind of stay on the straight and narrow path, if you will, of growing and developing the way that they need to live in the world that they're living in. And so, yes, you need rules. Yes, you need expectations. Yes, you need boundaries, but don't be an asshole about how you put them in place.
Yeah, right.
Like, if you can be firm
Yeah.
and kind. I know you really want that cookie. It's so frustrating when mommy says no and you want the cookie. And no, you can't have it.
Wow.
And
I actually feel
you're
good about
mad.
not getting the cookie right now. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. I know you're mad. If I were you, I'd be mad too. And my answer is no.
Right.
Right?
Yeah.
And so it's about having boundaries and not being awful.
So do you see some of the, because look, I guess it depends where you look as to whether or not how you assess, how teenagers and millennials behave now, but do you think some of the challenges that we're seeing, with these younger generations coming through is perhaps they didn't have strong boundaries that were put in place? Because I know for myself, I went into recovery when I was 19 for addiction.
Mm-hmm.
And ever since then, one of the things that I've become acutely aware of is the importance of structure and order and discipline. And the more structure I have in my life, the more order I have in my life, the more discipline I have in my life, the healthier I've become just as a human being.
Yeah.
But what's interesting is I've gone on to teach that to people who would not label themselves as addicts or in recovery, and I've seen the same levels of development in what you'd consider normal people by putting healthy boundaries and structures and discipline in place to become healthy human beings in general. And you mentioned it, and I just want to hit on this because I think it's an important part. How important is it for healthy human development to actually have strong boundaries in place and discipline, and the discipline to enforce those boundaries? Mm-hmm. And even routines as well that make those boundaries easier to deal with?
Incredibly important. And if you happen to be growing a child who has a sensitive kind of temperament, it's not just important, it's essential. They won't be able to manage without it because it creates such safety for them. And so having, your routines, how you say hello, how you say goodbye, how you do Monday evenings, how you do Friday evenings, what Sunday morning looks like, how you clean up, what your, song and dance is around brushing your teeth at night, how you manage disagreements, how you just kind of navigate your world. We are creatures of habit. We love the safety and containment, if I can use that word cautiously, of knowing what's coming, of having, an expectation for how this is all going to play out. And in fact, for homes that are in crisis, parents that are in crisis, kids that are in crisis, number one, first level intervention is to establish some routine and some structure.
Yeah, right.
Because it just, everybody takes a breath when we know where we're headed, what's happening now, what's happening next, what we can expect when A, B, or C goes down. It just everybody can take a breath. We all feel so much safer. And
are the boundaries really critical when it comes to developing a healthy relationship with our environment, like feeling safe, but also developing trust? Like how important are boundaries when it comes to, feeling safe in this world, but also developing healthy trust connections?
Yeah, so boundaries within self.
Yeah.
To be able to express your own need, to be able to say what you want, to be able to communicate what you know to be good for you, and then to hold that in relationship with other. Kids come into the capacity to do that when they are gifted the opportunity to experience that as young children, which also, we talk about boundaries and routines and sort of the more kind of like how your day looks and how you structure your environment. But think about, as adults, how if we confuse role and relationship, how gross we become with our children around boundaries, how intrusive we are, how in their space we are, how we talk over them and talk down to them and don't recognize that they're like soulful beings, who are here on this earth just like we are, and that we really need to, there's safety in the hierarchy of the parent-child relationship, so there is sort of this alpha role that parent takes on, but with so much love and so much compassion. And if we can recognize our children as those kinds of beings, we would never do and say to them the things that we are often coached to do and say to our children.
So a gentleman I met once upon a time, he said, talk to them as if they are a genius, and a genius they will become.
Beautiful.
And my son's going through this phase now where he's going, why?
Yeah.
And what's interesting is when I first experienced this phase with other people's kids, I was like, oh God, fuck, kill me now. But now with Noah, like we sat down and watched a series on Netflix called Cosmos. And because I'm pretty sure I've accidentally programmed him to become an astronaut by accident, just by singing him songs and creating.
Yes.
And so he was just like, what's that? I say, what it is? Why? What's that? Why? And for me, I'm in awe of this time right now. Like the explanation for things, the explanation for why. But what I'm doing is I'm actually talking to him as if I'm talking to like yourself, or like I'm talking to Matthias. I literally talk to him like he's an adult. And I'm not sure if I'm kidding myself, but he seems to have a level of comprehension that actually precedes what most people would assume a 3.8-year-old would be able to understand. Right. Am I deluded, or are they really able to comprehend at that level?
Yeah, they can. And there'll be two levels of that. There's one thing to intellectually, in a crystallized way, comprehend whatever it is that you're telling him, and really like understand that. But the other thing is to be in the dance with you, where he's just like, my dad's the coolest dad in all the land ever, and he just told me this awesome thing and I love it. He's really sort of like there's an energy about that as well. And I can even see it as you described, those conversations in your face. Yeah.
But do you think the way that we talk to our kids actually has a fundamental effect on how fast they develop? Because, I hear some kids that are in his grade, he does Montessori, so he's in like a 3 to 6 year old classroom. But I do hear some kids at his school, and even just at the playground, that are his age, that are talking as if they're babies. And I'm just curious, obviously that's coming from somewhere. So how important is it for us to not necessarily intellectualize everything to a point where perhaps it's complicating descriptions and explanations, but how important is it for us to actually talk to them like they're an adult? Or that they're like a comprehensive human being?
Like a genius.
Yeah, a genius.
I think it's think of how you're honoring them by just having this base assumption that they are capable and that you find them capable and full of potential. Think about what you're transmitting to them and speaking to them that way. And so I think that's a beautiful gift. The other thing that I have seen is that children will often, this isn't always why, but can be why they hang on to their baby voices, it's because when they were wee babes, they got a little stuck there in terms of getting their needs met, and they have discovered over time that if they can conjure the baby reaction, if they can elicit the sort of response that they got from their parents when they were babes, of having them sort of come and at least physically connect to them, that their needs are somehow being more met than if they were to be kind of a bit more independent and not kind of calling that forth. And so you can hear the baby voice. You see already in a 3-4-year-old how off it sounds when they have the baby voice. Yeah. So picture that in a 9, 10, 14, 15-year-old. Which
18-year-old, 24-year-old. Like I've met people in relationships before, especially in my earlier years, where all of a sudden this baby voice comes out and you're like, oh, what the hell?
And you get a little like...
Yeah, like this doesn't make sense.
So it's somebody going back to like age regressing really, and how they're interacting to try and have their need met.
So is it on some level destructive to have the boo 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 dee dee boo dee? Or did a baby have a boo boo, like to a toddler? Like is that like maybe once in a while? I'm going to assume that's not going to be fundamentally destructive. But if we are constantly using that dialogue or that voice, can that be something that over time can be damaging?
Well, I think you need to be picking up what your kids are putting down and reading their cues. And so as your child is shifting out of that, then you need to be shifting out of that. We know for very, very young, like little wee babies, we call it motherese, which is quite an exclusionary term, but you could call it fatherese as well, which is that sing-songy voice that we use to talk with them. And neurologically, it does light them up a lot more than the sort of monotone adult kind of voice. And so there is something about this natural way of how we speak to very young children. And as we tune into them, and in being tuned into them, see them growing and shifting in terms of their responses and just kind of who they are and how they are, we should naturally see that shifting out of us as well, so that our voice begins to match developmentally where they're at, which is no longer, a little 1-month-old baby. Now they're 3.
You touched on something there around the vocal variety that is used, when we, use that particular voice. I discovered this about 18 months ago when my son was having a complete meltdown. No one could settle him. So I came down, I took him, he's toddler at this point, and then I literally just all of a sudden thought about the movie voice, in a world. And I just started telling this, in a world where Noah ruled supreme. And I started telling this story. Within 5 seconds, he'd stopped crying. And because I just used this massive vocal variety, and it completely captured his attention. And it was so significant that I actually use that in my communication style with him now. Like when I want to get his attention, or I'm trying to impact him, I'll use, large levels of vocal variety. And intellectually, it makes sense because these little soft psychologies are so easily distracted where they are right now. And the more animation we can give them, the stronger the attention will be. How important is it for a parent to be considering, the variety and the vocal variety that we use when we communicate? So
2 things about that. I think, first of all, I always talk about the hamster wheel and how sometimes you got to bump them onto a new wheel. And so kids can get, especially when they've gotten big into a dysregulated state, that's the wheel they're on right now. Yeah. And to have some kind of a distraction action that you can kind of bring to bear on the situation. So for my boys, when they were about that age, I would have offered them a cold drink of water, something sensorial that would have kind of jolted them off that hamster wheel and maybe onto something different. And I can see how the introduction of this very sort of theatrical voice.
In a world.
Yeah, I love that. I love it. And so I sort of think on a sensory level, that's a real change in what they're experiencing, and you could essentially bump them off that hamster wheel and onto sort of...
So like a sensory pattern interrupt.
Exactly. Yeah. Exactly. The other thing is, what a brilliant alpha way of stepping into the situation and being in the lead of it. Where you're just, it's like stepping in and taking charge and letting them know you're right there and you've got this and you're not upset and nothing bad's about to happen, but here you are and you've got this, right? And so you're present and you're large and in charge in the loveliest way without having flipped your lid or anything along those lines. He would just be able to literally just be like, oh, thanks, Dad. There you are. I lost you there for a second, but now I'm back online and I hear you, I see you, thank you.
Wow. What a perspective. Okay, that was good. So let's talk practical discipline for a second. And I want to talk practical as in, this is a challenge that I've had with Noah for a little while now.
Okay.
He's an incredibly loving child, caring child, nurturing child, but he loves to hit. And it's so out of character for his personality type. But it's been... for as long as I can remember.
Okay.
Now, I've kind of rationalized by going, well, it's something he'll grow out of. I've been I was a competitive fighter. I started martial arts when I was 10. So there's a very strong genealogy of, learning how to use for combat. And so this part is well, shit, is there any part of this that he's picked up from the genealogy? And the second part of me is how do I intervene in a way that is really healthy? Because I've literally tried everything. Because we don't spank, we don't do timeouts, but I do occasionally, when it's extreme, for a regulation technique, is use what I call the contemplation corner. If he's so extreme and his meltdown is so big, I will literally walk him into the corner and say, look, I just want you to contemplate for a second, just stand there for a second. And normally within about a minute to a minute and a half, his temperament will come down, he'll be calm, and then we can have a conversation. So it's not something I'll pepper on a regular basis. But when it comes to the hitting, as I said, we've tried the contemplation corner, we've tried the bargaining, I've tried to sit down and have the conversation with him, and I still don't know where I'm at with it. From a practical sense, let's just say he walks in right now, walks over to Matthias, says hi to Matthias, and just gives him a big clock in the face, but he doesn't see anything wrong with it. What's the best way for me to intervene in a way that will help him understand that that's a boundary that he's crossed, and help him and reinforce the hope of a different behaviour in the future in a similar situation?
So I have a couple questions.
Yeah, please.
So would he always just clock hey, Matthias, and then clocks him, or is it often in a heated kind of moment?
It's almost never in a heated moment. He's not an angry child.
Okay.
In 99% of the situations, it started off with just my wife, my ex-wife. He would hit her, he'd never hit me. I was just not, I wasn't even something he would even consider. And then it was the nanny. And then, and I've just observed that it comes out from time to time rarely ever towards me and always typically towards feminine energy, which, is interesting but also concerning. And sometimes kids at school.
Okay, I'm not concerned about it at all.
Okay.
He has basically no frontal lobe functioning, so he's not managing his impulses, period.
You don't know him as well as I do, so come on.
Say again?
I said you don't know him as well as I do. His frontal lobes are working hard.
Really juicy.
Thick and rich and full of neural connections.
We expect that he is not going to be able to manage impulses well at this stage in life.
Right, okay.
The other thing that I've recently been having a lot of dialogue about with my colleagues and my partner is the idea of what we call attention-seeking behaviors. And if we can change the word attention-seeking to connection-seeking.
I knew you were going to say that.
Right? And so for some reason, and interesting that it's around feminine energy. Who knows what's behind all of that?
Oftentimes to get my attention. So
right.
Yeah.
So there's this connection-seeking energy behind it. And so the answer to kind of reshaping that, first of all, what's your script around it? Hands are not for hitting.
Oh,
that's our rule.
Right.
As a family, that's how we do things. In this family, we don't use our hands to solve our problems. Hands are not for hitting. Now, we say for adults that the road to hell is paved with good intentions.
Yeah.
Not true for your children. Your children will have the best of intentions and not be able to deliver on them. And so just because you've said to him, hands are not for hitting in this family, that is not how we do things. We use our gentle hands, that's how we manage. And then you say to him, can I count on you to keep your hitting hands put away? And he'll say, yes, Daddy. And then he'll mess it up, probably the same day, right? Because he's a child and he has no impulse control. And so that's how it's supposed to be. But you continue to give him the script. Remember what the rule is. Hands are not for hitting.
Right.
And not in a pissed off way, not in a mean way, but in a firm way.
Right.
That will not happen again.
Calm, assertive.
Yeah.
Okay.
Calm, assertive.
Yeah.
Firm but kind.
Yeah.
Right?
Okay, I like that.
And then figure out what's the unmet need. If it's connection-seeking behavior, then there's obviously a need for connection somewhere around. And so if you can kind of be, not even just in that moment, but is it often in the morning time? Is it often in the evenings when he comes home from being at school all day and he needs his fill of connection because he's kind of been emptied out? Are there other sort of antecedents or setting events that would sort of have him needing to kind of top up his reserves of having been filled by you or by his mom? And however you can just like breathe more connection into his day, you'll be able to kind of preventatively get in front of it and then know it's going to happen again.
Right.
But it won't be happening when he's 7 or 8.
Okay, that's good. Okay, so I'm going to see if I can put together a little bit of a framework around is there a framework for discipline without damage? Because what I heard you say was script, and I was like, ooh, I like that. Like, what's your script for that? So as parents, when it comes to disciplining our children and not threatening the connection and not using physical violence, is there like an actual framework, like script comes first, then question comes, like, what's the framework? Child misbehaves? What's the framework? Yeah.
So in my book, I talk about 9 stepping stones, which you'll never in one moment be like, okay.
All right, what was fucking number 8?
Right? Oh my God. Even as I sit here now, I'm like, should I really tell them the 9 stepping stones? Because I don't know if I remember them all. So imagine when you're in a moment with your child, like there's just no way that you're going to be able to pull up, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. But the idea is, in reading through the 9 stepping stones, it starts to breathe some life into what does this, like in a concrete way, look like, when you get home and Noah, that's his name, is coming at you with something and you're like, oh yeah, no, this is not working. How are we going to manage that? And so there's a number of things that I can talk parents through, and I'll give you some examples of what those stepping stones would look like. So one would be to get in there, and the first thing is to respond with some connection. You look so upset. You're having a really hard time, which is, we all want to be seen and heard. That's connection. Yeah. I see you.
Is it important for us to get down to their level?
Yeah, you can to be sort of on eye level to make sure that they're there and seeing you. So when you were describing the meltdown that he had that nobody could get into, he didn't even know you were there.
Yeah, he was like...
Until you changed to your big movie voice, and then he was like, oh, hey. How's it going? And so to be able to enter into the situation and be like, yeah, you're having a hard time. This is a terrible thing, right? So that's
not going to reinforce the situation, because there'd be some people that would go, well, because for me, I hear that language like, well, I'm telling him he's having a bad day. Do I want to be presenting this circumstance and giving him a reference?
Think about the last time you were having a terrible day.
Yeah.
And you came into a space with somebody you loved, be it a romantic partner or a friend, and you were like, I'm having a terrible day.
I just don't use that language anymore.
You may not.
Yeah.
Let's say you're having an off day, whatever your language is, and they're like, yeah, what are you going to do next? Not your evolved self, your child self.
Well, I'd probably want to get a little bit, I wouldn't feel understood. I'd probably...
Now you're going to prove your point.
Oh, yeah, okay, yeah.
And get louder.
Yeah, okay.
And bigger.
Yeah.
And more intense.
Okay.
Right? So make sure they feel seen and heard.
Right.
You come in and you say, ugh, this is terrible. You're so frustrated. And this needs to stop. We do not, my boys, I was explaining to you earlier, we grow really big boys. And so they would be, getting into it in the living room about something. And if I were just like, boys, hands are not for hitting, right? Like somebody would die. Somebody needs to get in there. And so I'd launch my body in between the two of them and I'd be shoving them apart and I'd be saying things like, this is not working. You're very frustrated and it must stop. We are not using our hands to solve this problem. You will be staying here and I will be right back.
Right.
You are coming with me. And I know it's hard to be a big brother. I'll be right back. Oh, you're so frustrated to the other child. Right? Like that's how I'm moving it around the space. So
we're not trying to paint it with positivity. We're trying to address it based on the reality.
Like I see you and I hear you and this is not going well.
Yeah.
So the first thing is to meet them where they're at and meet them with some relationship and some connection. I get it. It's hard. You're frustrated. The second thing is to get in and drop a flag and then get out. And so lots of parents have the tendency to be like, how many times have I told you you're not supposed to, blah, blah, blah. And already there's no lid.
Yeah.
And so you're talking to the reptilian brain, so how's that going to work out?
Yeah.
There is no lid. They're not comprehending. You're like Charlie Brown, wah, 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 wah. That's not working. And so stop talking. And my challenge to parents is to get your flag in, your warning flag.
Right.
So
the flag is the warning flag.
You're dropping the flag, like the red flag, right? 6 words or less. Hands are not for hitting.
Right.
This needs to stop.
Right.
We don't use those words. Like whatever it is.
Right.
That's it. And then get out. If you stay in too long, what's going to happen is their defenses are going to come up. Their attachment, we call it defensive detaching, when you're not feeling understood and you're feeling like you're being sort of...
Defensive detaching.
Yes, they're going to put the wall up. And now you're not going to have any cooperation whatsoever. You thought you didn't have cooperation before? Well, hold on.
Right.
It's going to get big now.
Yeah.
So you get in and you get out. And then you need to move forward with getting them onto something different. And so we're just going through the reset button, and that might be the big movie voice. It might be getting them a drink of water. It might be moving them to a new space, something that you can do to get them off the hamster wheel.
So again, some physical intervention, physical interruption, a pattern interruption that is sensory and large sensory.
Yeah, big sensory. Right. I had one mom, her boy was on the autism spectrum, and it was really challenging to get him off of the hamster wheel.
Yeah.
And so she would just get an ice cube and gently brush it 2 or 3 times on his cheek, and he'd be like, oh, hey. Because he was so locked down in where he was, he couldn't actually climb out of it until you gave him that interruption.
Okay.
Mm-hmm. The other thing that I encourage parents to do is to avoid explaining. So in the moment, this is not the time to go into why we're not giving you the cookie before dinner and that it'll spoil your appetite, because what's the next words out of your child's mouth?
But why?
And no, it won't.
No, okay,
if I give you this cookie, you'll not eat your dinner. Yes, I will. I promise. Have they accepted your no?
No.
Why?
Well, because they believe something different.
Yeah, and you're still talking.
Wow.
You're giving them all these little escape routes. You might eat your dinner, but your brother won't. Well, I'll hide in the pantry. He'll never know. Right? Is he accepting your no? Why? Because you're still talking. Right. So stop explaining. There are no explanations until your child has firmly accepted the no. And you'll know because their energy will change.
Yeah.
Ugh. Okay, Mom.
Oh, I love that. That was big.
You know, if we eat our cookies before dinner, it spoils our appetite, right?
Yeah.
That's when you explain.
Right.
Right? And then the other thing is that there is a time and place for debriefing it. The time and place is not, well, the lid is flipped.
Yeah, right.
And so to wait for the lid to come back on, for your child to be regulated, for them to be settled, for them to be calmed, which may take 5 seconds, 5 minutes, 5 hours, or if you have a teenager, 5 days. And then when it's back in place, then you come back around and you say, hey, we need to talk about a little earlier when you said hi to Matthias and walloped him on the side of the head. Right. We don't do that.
So we revisit that.
Mm-hmm. And because as humans, we want to close the communication loop. Yeah. We want that to be resolved. If we don't resolve that for our children, they catastrophically resolve it themselves by going to the worst possible, daddy hates me, Matthias is mad at me, those kinds of things. And so we want to resolve that for them. We want to close the loop. So do make sure you come back around and revisit.
Yeah, I like that. Wow. Mm-hmm. That was powerful. Thank you for that.
Good.
Yeah. Ooh. I keep having little tears of inspiration, like that just drop out of my left eye, which is, I think, the soul eye. So this is whatever's happening.
I love that.
It's soul deep. Okay. So have we talked about how we... Well, actually, I'll ask you the question because I know we've kind of skirted around. We've talked about discipline, and I believe we've touched on this, but I'm going to ask the direct question. Like, how do we instill a boundary in a healthy way without crushing their spirit?
Mm-hmm. So... part of what we need to give our children is to communicate what is needed for self and in various situations that will arise as they go through life. And so putting a boundary in place in a healthy way is without strings attached, without any sort of manipulative energy, putting into the space between us and them, this is how it's going to be. And I understand you're upset.
Right.
It's that beautiful balance of being firm and kind. And I always talk about, I grew up on the prairies here in Canada, Alberta.
Oh, wow. Okay, so my ex-wife is from Saskatchewan. So
no kidding.
Yeah, so I've been to Saskatoon many times.
Oh, I'm headed to Saskatoon in a couple of weeks.
Really?
Yeah,
oh my God, small world.
And so country music was part of how I grew up. And there's this song, and now I can't think of the artist, but I'll start walking your way, you start walking mine.
Right.
We'll meet in the middle beneath that old Georgia pine. Somebody will know.
I like that, yeah.
And so I always
that wasn't Pikes, was it? Northern Pikes?
No.
No? Okay.
I always think about that as the firm but kind dance, where, and often, particularly in two-parent households, but also in single parent households, where we tend to kind of identify with either being the firm parent or being the kind parent. It's hard to find both those things existing simultaneously at the same time. But if you can think about, like, the view from the top of this mountain is a brilliant view, and that's where firm and kind live together. And if you get too firm, you'll roll down this side of the mountain and become an asshole. If you get too kind, you roll down this side of the mountain. You're like this jellyfish parent where there's no guardrails on your bridge, and it freaks your kids out, right? Yeah. And so in terms of putting healthy boundaries into place, if you can think about what it means to be firm and kind, that's a beautiful combination, and that's where the healthy imposition of a boundary will flow from.
Oh, I love that. That's fantastic. Okay. All right, there's someone that I want to go next. It's driven by a couple questions we've had on Snapchat and Instagram, and also my own situation. So my wife and I, unfortunately, we separated about 3.5 months ago now. I think it was about in May. She moved out, I think it was maybe 6 weeks ago. So we're in this situation right now. It's very amicable so far. There was one small hiccup, but we're very amicable, both what I'd consider to be, conscious parents with the best intentions for our son, and also mutually healthy connections with each other. But we're embarking on nesting. So nesting is something that I became aware of. I heard a buzzword in an interview once, and then I started to research it, and it became quite timely when the separation took place. So when we talk about separation, because I think for a lot of people, I came from a broken home. And I think for me, one of my ideals was, like, when I get married, it's going to be for life. When I have a child, I'm going to give them what I didn't have. Essentially trying to heal many of my own wounds. And when the concept was first, introduced, the idea of separation was first introduced, which was about 2 years ago when my wife first uttered the words, I was completely devastated. Like, I never would have imagined in a million years that I would have found myself in that situation. And then over time, I kind of, slowly desensitized to the idea, because I started to realize, well, shit, if this actually happens, I need to be mentally strong enough to be there for myself, but most especially for Noah, because,
Sure.
If this were to happen, I can't lose my shit. So I started to look at also the research. What happened, when kids that come from broken homes, are X percentage more likely to develop unhealthy, either codependent relationships or addictions or anything else. And for many parents, myself especially, I was like, holy shit, I've got to do whatever I can to save this relationship, even if that means sacrificing myself, because I need to give this kid the best chance at life. And then reality kicked in, and it was, and it just wasn't going to play out that way. And then I started to, adapt to the idea that, okay, well, obviously this is the way it's going to be for now. We're obviously going to separate, and we've got to do the best job that we can to ensure that we raise, a healthy little being. So nesting is a concept that maybe some people aren't familiar with, which is whereby the primary house is where the child lives, and the parents, they basically stop in and out for whether it be 2 days at a time, 3 days at a time, or a week at a time in between. And we're doing that quite well. But I'm curious to know from your experience, how has nesting, do you have any experience with nesting at all?
I haven't done that myself. I have many client families that have done that.
Fantastic.
Sure.
So from your experiencing, is nesting something that should be considered in the situations where it's amicable, where it can work, as a healthy next step to limit the amount of emotional disturbance and potential destruction that can go on in a child's mind when their parents are separating?
Yeah. So when you think about what's happening in the family dynamic when the parents are separating, there's a lot of change and a lot of disruption and a lot of loss. Loss of the family unit in the form that we once knew it, but also little losses like, mornings look different, or other kinds of changes are happening. And so really, if we're thinking about the child's best interest, if it's amicable and it can be managed in a healthy way where there isn't a lot of conflict around it, the idea of nesting is a really beautiful idea, because it really does minimize the change for the child. And always being mindful that children don't create that. They don't create separations. They don't ask for that. Those are adult decisions that happen in adult relationships. And my view is that it is thus up to the adults to figure it out. It's up to the adults to take the hit where they can in shielding their children. And so if one of the things is that you're inconvenienced by having to come and go from your home, where your child gets to really enjoy this sort of continuity of sameness, at least in terms of their physical surrounds. Like, what a lovely thing to do for your child who's 3 and you're 42. So guess who gets to handle it? You get to handle it, right?
And I agree, like, it is a massive inconvenience, but at no point do I look at it as a massive inconvenience, because I know it's just something that I have to do.
You have eyes only for him. That's
I'm
what
a little
it
bit
is.
biased, I am.
Which is beautiful. It's as it should be.
Well, as long as it's healthy, for me, that's most important. But I'm curious to know, like, when we, as conscious parents, enter into the separation, process, we enter into the co-parenting dynamic, we're starting off with nesting. What's a good time frame? And I'm actually asking this not just for myself, but for other people as well. What is a healthy time frame when it is amicable to nest to a period where it's like, okay, he understands, we've done enough. It's now time to actually start, navigating the migration of, 2 household co-parenting families.
I think that will depend on 2 things: the age of your children and also their temperament. And so in every family dynamic, every constellation of siblings and combinations therein, that's going to look a little bit different, and you are going to have to use your intuition as a parent to figure out what the ideal is. As a sort of ballpark, most of my families that I work with, that has lasted somewhere between 6 and 12 months. And then people start to get a little bit of an itch to even the kids, like, they want to have landed. They want to know that they're where they're going to be. And everybody, as the initial shockwave of this happening and what that's all going to look and feel like kind of begins to subside. And we've had our tears about it, and we've sort of adapted a little bit and come to terms with some of our futility around that. We all have this desire for growth. We all have this desire for stepping forward. And so, it's when those the energy like that starts to present itself that you have to listen to that voice and then know that that's probably time for you and for your children to start to think about, what's this now going to look like? How is it going to take shape?
I think it's probably important also to help people at home understand, who are listening to this, what situations don't suit nesting. Because I think sometimes, parents go, well, it's a new concept, it's new, it's shiny, we'll do that, not realizing that there's, because you mentioned the key word, because there's one key word that if that's present, nesting's not going to work. So under what circumstances does nesting not work?
So when things are not amicable, when things are very challenging, what will happen is there'll be so much contamination of the space because the parents aren't able to regulate, the parents aren't able to be in a good place themselves by being in the physical surrounds of their home, feeling the intrusiveness of the other parent, for example, having to watch their backs, all of the gross stuff that starts to happen when conflict really mushrooms around all of that. When it's that kind of feeling around, then it's possible that nesting's not going to be the best. And know that you are now introducing more loss, more rupture for children who are already enduring a significant loss, right? And so there's a sacrifice involved, and you have to sort of be thinking about, like, if you need to be the best possible parent at this time, that's very, very challenging. How is that going to be accomplished? How can you live that out and, as best as possible, give your kids some continuity in their lives while everything around them shifts and changes?
Is there an easy answer for how do we separate in the healthiest way in order to preserve the psychology of the child to be able to blossom into an incredible, healthy human being?
Yeah,
which is a tough question to answer when you consider the emotions that's often involved.
Yeah. The thing is that if we can think of families who are separating and divorcing are not by definition broken. They are simply taking on a new form, a new shape. They continue to exist as a family for now and into all of eternity. That's the family, right? And maybe you'll add members to the family. Maybe there'll be other changes that have that family taking shape in different ways as time marches on. But you will always be a family. So you and Noah's mother are always going to be a family. You are not broken unless you allow yourselves to be broken.
Yeah, right.
And so what does that look like to remain whole, to be an intact family where there's been divorce and separation? And really what that is, the first thing is that we have to put the needs of our children front and center. We get so bogged down in our own egos when things become conflictual around divorce and separation.
You've been through separation yourself? Okay.
I have, within the last year.
Oh, wow.
Yes, with 2 children.
How long were you married, if you don't mind me asking?
16 years.
Holy smokes.
Yeah.
Well, my condolences, but I'm sure it was for the right reasons.
I think so.
Yeah.
And as we emerge through in terms of understanding, like, what does that look like?
Yeah.
Are we going to allow ourselves to be broken, or are we going to find our way forward in the best interests of our children and ourselves as human soulful beings? How is that going to take shape? How are we going to co-parent? How are we going to find our way through all of this and be whole? And so my understanding of that from an attachment perspective is that dynamic continues. And so we had a family meeting on Saturday morning just this past weekend. My children's father has recently started dating, and so there was the
This is the first relationship since split? Wow, okay.
And so there's angst around that. Like, they're like, what does that mean, and how's that going to go? And it was wonderful to sit down with them, with their dad and myself and our 2 boys, having this conversation, and let them know that whoever daddy loves, and if it's a big love, a love that's here for a long while, I will love that person too. That person now becomes part of my family. And why does that person become part of my family? Because I love their father.
Yeah.
And why do I love their father? Well, I love him as a human being, and I love him always and forever because he's your father.
Yeah, right.
And so, like, you could see them be like, oh, okay.
It sounds to me like a fundamental development moment for them both.
I think so.
Yeah.
Yeah. And so you can see how when you're very conscious about all of the stuff that can come up in self and another, and the projections and the transference and all the things happening with your children and in the spousal relationship, when you can really work, and we all fall down, and we all have moments where it's not terribly conscious. It's ego-driven and it's yucky.
The human experience.
But if we can continue to choose again, if we can continue to get back on our feet and find our way to wholeness, to have unlimited honoring of what family is in all of its different constellations and iterations. That's our new reality, right? As a generation, where I think the divorce rate sits at 55+% now.
I think in Australia it's 2 and 3.
Yeah, so 66%. Right?
Yeah,
so that's what it is.
Yeah.
And so how are we going to navigate that consciously? How are we going to find our way through that, understanding that we are all souls, that we are all here to sort of evolve, and that this is happening because that's the way that it needed to be for the evolution of our souls on this planet in this lifetime. And so how do I know it's perfect? Because it needs to be this way.
So you touched on a good point there, the introduction of a new person into the family relationship. And as I'm learning, everyone moves at different speeds. And what I'm curious to know, is there a strategy, or is there a way to look at introducing new relationships into that unit to ensure that we preserve, whatever connections that the child is making to that situation?
Yeah. So let's talk about the attachment dynamic and the concept of polarization, because it comes to bear very directly on the question that you've asked. And so in our attachment mind, particularly when things are emotionally big for a child, they have eyes but for one person, one attachment figure. And so if you, in a completely different setting, if you ever talk to childcare providers or teachers of very young children, you'll show up at the end of the day to pick them up, and then all of a sudden they'll start to act out and be really crazy just as you arrive on the scene to pick them up. And the teacher can often be heard saying, I promise you they were not like this before you came, right? And then the parents are like, what is it about me that I bring this out in my child? Yeah. What's happening is they only have attachment eyes for one. And so now we've introduced another, and they're like, wee, wee. They're trying to figure out, where do I look and how, and it's a dysregulating experience. And so now let's bring this to bear on the concept of separation and divorce and the realigning of the family unit. And so let's say there's two parents, parent 1 and parent 2. If we can go through separation and divorce with both of them being right here, so that the child, energetically, when they look out, they only have to look in one direction. Because mommy's on the same team as daddy, and daddy's on the same team as mommy, and daddy and mommy love each other, even if they're not together. There's love that flows in that relationship because we are family, right? And so they look out, and they only have to look in one direction. They don't have to navigate all the yucky stuff that happens when parents alienate and bad talk and do all that kind of stuff. Because if we're doing that, we've created this dynamic where now they're going to be looking back and forth. So now we're bringing in another adult, right? So daddy has a new girlfriend or mommy has a new boyfriend. We want that person to land on the same attachment page. We want the relationship with child to flow through the existing relationships here, so that the child still only has to be looking one direction. Now, of interest, when the child is in right relationship with the father, the introduction of mother's new partner will go much more smoothly. When the child is in right relationship with mother, the introduction of the father's new partner will also go much more smoothly. It's like if you're in right relationship with your father, that another male has come on the scene in your family is going to play out for you much more easily, because you aren't going to be having to preserve loyalty with your dad. Okay. And especially if your dad says, you know what, whoever mommy loves, A, I trust her, she has wonderful judgment, and B, I love her, and I will love that new person as a valued member of our family. Imagine all of the children in the world, the 66% of the kids in Australia, who are just gonna be like, thank God! It releases them from all of this yuckiness. And so, for there to be that kind of relational dynamic in and amongst all the adults involved, that there's openness and flow and communication, and not that you're going on family vacation together necessarily, but that you've created space and room for all of you to exist without our egos being challenged and having to rise to defend ourselves and all of those kinds of complications.
And because it can be quite threatening for the role as well, I imagine, for some parents, when another potential partner is put on the table to be introduced, it's like, well, hang on, is my role in jeopardy here, which is what's happening for me. Like it's bringing up all this interesting stuff that I didn't even think that was inside.
So lucky you.
Yeah, I know, right?
Because now you get to heal that part of yourself, right?
Now, I don't want this to sound like a loaded question, and I am asking for for people at home and also for myself. Are there things that we need to be aware of when we are considering introducing new people into that family dynamic? Is there an appropriate time frame? Is there an appropriate length that the relationship should be going before we even consider that, so that we're not creating even more change and even more turmoil for the child?
Yeah, and so I don't have an easy answer for you on that. However, I would suggest to you that your children have come through, for any family where there's this changing dynamic, and not that we're broken, but rather that we're sorting ourselves out, and we've taken on this new form, and now we're figuring out how to sort of navigate through that. When there's been big change like that, the last thing that you want to do is have this sort of, chain of different people coming and going from your child's life, because you're just introducing more loss and more loss and more loss. So to be conscious of that, to know when you're meeting your own selfish ego kinds of needs versus really sort of soulfully entering into a relational space with another human being that's going to partner with you in a spiritual kind of way as we journey through life. And so, it depends on the level and the dynamic of the relationship. It depends on your history with that person. It depends on a lot of things in terms of how soon is too soon, and when do you introduce, and how long should you be in the relationship. That there's no hard and fast rules. And so I think that we all have to sort of feel our way through that intuitively. Okay. And like the thin wafer, that is what we're like concretely conscious about, and the ocean underneath. It's in the ocean that your intuition sort of like comes out from that, and it's full of wisdom. Yeah. So when you have like a sense about things, listen to that. It's probably guiding you in the right direction.
I think that's great advice. And look, I find this is to be an incredibly exciting time, because I haven't thought about dating for a very long time, but now that I am, it's not like before. It's not like, well, hang on, I can just go and get online, jump online, and go and meet someone and just carry on as if I was when I was in my early 30s.
Well, you could. But how's that going to work out?
How's that going to play out, right? It's not going to be great for the little guy. So what would you give as advice to perhaps parents that are going through a separation right now, and they're still trying to find their way with egos being present and maybe perhaps a little bit of conflict in play? Is there a bit of maybe it might be a little bit of tough love, or a little bit of a warning that might kind of just, act as a gestalt or an interruption to go, hang on, we need to put our shit to the side here, because we're actually dealing with the potential life and generations of future generations to come from what we're doing right now. What would you do to really wake people up to the importance of separating in a really healthy and productive way?
In terms of the well-being of their children.
Yeah, and themselves.
Yeah. I mean, I think that if we can take a breath and go inside ourselves and really connect with who we are, really understand the light of every being involved in the circumstance, even if we're in a challenging dynamic with our soon-to-be former spouse, if we can see them for who they really are, not get lost in the crust of the ego, which can create all sorts of noise and allow you to amass all sorts of evidence so that you can hate them and get your lawyer all over them and those kinds of things. But if we can really sort of see through that to the light of who they are, and as our children react and their behaviors become challenging and things become difficult, if we can see through that to the light of who they are, and just remember, like, we're all friendly souls, we're all here just trying to figure out the same thing, we can consciously step forward in a way that's going to allow everybody to be much more settled and much more whole and much less wounded by the process. I'm living this all out as I'm speaking to you about this today. Yeah. And so it's not going to be my next book, like too soon. But I really do think that there's a place for having a more public conversation about divorce without damage.
I have to agree.
Right? Like, how are we going to navigate
Please write that book.
Okay.
Please write Divorce Without Damage. That's a great title.
I've already got it started.
You already got it started? Oh, that's fantastic.
Yeah. But it's a little ways off. I got to live some of it out first.
Well, that's the best way to teach. Oftentimes
Sure.
we're here to learn. We're here to teach what we need to learn the most. Sometimes,
The wounded healer.
The wounded healer. Yeah. Wow. I've actually never heard that before, but that makes so much sense. So let's talk to the people who are perhaps a little bit more into their separation. They're now in a co-parenting environment. What is there? Is there an ideal way to co-parent? Is there a user's manual, a how-to guide?
There isn't yet. We can talk about creating one.
You're going to be writing one soon,
right.
but yeah.
The whole thing about co-parenting is to make sure that the needs of the children are front and center, and that the egos of the parents aren't getting in the way of that we're really able to come on to the same page and talk through, what's happening, that the communication channels are open. What happens for children is that if they in any way feel like they're bridging the gap, like they're having to take information back and forth because parents aren't communicating, that they're having to listen to the chirping of another parent about, the mom that they love or the dad that they love. All of that's creating separation all around them, all sorts of disconnection. And so in your co-parenting dynamic, what can you be doing to make sure that you are minimizing any separations where possible? So when we talked about nesting and those kinds of things, what are you doing to minimize the separations that exist and the losses and the ruptures that can come with the changing family dynamic? And where they can't be minimized, what are you doing to bridge them, to build a bridge over the separation so that they aren't so impactful? And so when a child is in the other parent's home and they're missing this parent, what is that parent doing to bridge the child back? So that the parents are in the lead. The parents are taking responsibility for making sure it's all flowing. That the parent ensures that the phone call happens. That the parent has the ritual every night of gazing out at the star and telling the child that mommy's gazing at the same star. And isn't it magical that we can all look up at this twinkling star together? I made that up on the spot.
No, but I like it. But I see the intent there.
Right? The idea is that we
fill the gap. I'm missing mummy. Mummy loves you. Mummy loves you. Right? Remember, do you want to call mummy? Should we FaceTime mummy now? Yeah, right.
There's this beautiful children's storybook called The Invisible String, which doesn't come to bear on the concept of divorce and separation directly. But the idea is that when we love somebody, our hearts are connected by this invisible string. And if you want to feel that person and their presence, you just got to tug on the string. And mommy will feel it, daddy will feel it, and they'll tug back. And you wait. You'll know what that feels like when they do.
Oh my God.
Yeah, see, that gives me goosebumps.
Oh my God. Can you text Harley right now and ask her to order that book? Okay. Wow. Okay, that's cool. So tell me about your see it, feel it, believe it approach to parenting.
See it, feel it, be it.
Sorry, see it, feel it, what did I say? Believe it. See it, feel it, be it.
But in the being of it, you are kind of becoming a believer of it. So that was a lovely little slip. So see it, feel it, then be it.
Yeah.
The majority of contemporary parenting literature and practices stops at see it. And so when I was writing my book and in all of the workshops and teaching that I do, I really came to understand the problem that we have is that we are looking at the outside. We see the hitting hands and we don't like them. We see the child who's not doing as we've asked them to do, and we don't like that. And we're stopping there and wanting to address that piece of things. But that's not the whole thing. And if we stop right there, what we're going to look for are really scripted strategies. Timeouts. 1, 2, 3 magics. That kind of stuff, right?
Manipulation.
Absolutely. Because that's all you see. You just want the behavior to stop. You don't see everything that's behind it. Right? And yet, if we go to those scripted things, first of all, they're all sacrificial plays. And secondly, do you think that you're actually in charge when your child sees you thumbing through the parenting manual to figure out what stepping stone 8 is? You're not in charge. When I work with parents in my office, I say to them, please do not tell your child you are coming here. There's no faster way to dethrone yourselves than to tell your kid, you got to come speak to a psychologist to figure them out. They just need to know that you get this.
Right.
They need to be able to lean into you that way. Yeah, right. And so, I forget the question.
At least I feel better now. You did that just for me. Thank you. I appreciate it. See it, feel it, be it approach.
So we need to be able to move past the external. We need to go very quickly into the feeling of it. And so when you see a child hit, when you see a child losing it, when you see a child struggling, think about them and what must be happening inside. Go beyond the seeing very quickly into the feeling. And if you can go there, like if you can get behind the crust of the external and actually get inside their mind, inside their soul, and really feel what is happening for them, you will not but be able to help yourself of being for them what they need you to be in that moment. And you don't need me to tell you. Like, you don't need me to say, first you're going to say this, and then you're going to say that, and then you're going to do blah, 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 right? You'll just become for them in the moment. Powerful. So that's the see it, then the feel it, then the be it.
And the be it is consequential.
The being is what you're going to step into alongside them because you're feeling them. You know, when I talk about this at workshops, I use the example of, let's say you go home this evening and you're sitting down to an evening cup of tea and your front doorbell rings and you open your door and on your front porch is your best friend, sobbing inconsolably with grief. What are you going to do, right? And so if you're going to stop at see it and feel like, oh my God, I need to figure out what I'm supposed to do when I have grief-stricken friends, you'll look at them really awkwardly. You won't be able to get into their mind, into their soul and feel where they're coming from. And you'll be like, just 1 second, will you run back into your living room and pull the book off the shelf that gives you the 4-step strategy for consoling grief-stricken friends, right? And so as your friend watches you do that, how are they feeling? How awesome is it that they showed up on your porch? How delighted are they with that choice, right? They're probably thinking, why am I here and who are you? Yeah. Ugh, bye, right? Instead, what most people are gonna do when they open their door and see their grief-stricken friend on their front porch is they're gonna be like, oh my God, what happened? They'll step out, they'll throw their arms around them, they'll love them up, they'll pull them into their house, they'll pour them copious amounts of tea, they'll wrap blankets around their shoulders, they'll rub their backs, they'll talk them through, they'll do whatever they do that's gonna come out of them really naturally. Why? Because they went beyond seeing. They went into feeling. Out of feeling becomes being. So if you can see it and then quickly move into feeling it, you will be for your child what it is that they need.
So I'm noticing in your methodology there's very strong levels of empathy and connection.
Yes.
Like it's almost like those are if I'm wrong, please correct me. From what I've heard, like it's almost like there's this umbrella of empathy and connection that drives all of the things that we're trying to essentially achieve. Mm-hmm. So what do we do in this situation where perhaps the parents had a wound and they lack empathy or they don't have empathy? How does someone go about learning to become empathetic?
Yeah, do your own work.
Right, good answer.
So where are you not being empathetic towards self? If you can't be empathetic toward your child, it's because you lack the capacity to have empathy for self. Somewhere in you, that's what's happening, and now you've projected that onto your dynamic with your child. Right? The other thing that I will do when I'm working with families, and people come at all different places in life, and sometimes the reality is their work is not happening right now because we're in survival mode and we just got to get to tomorrow. And so then what we do is we broaden the lens and we look to the village. Who in the village can be available to be the connection person for this child? Well, the parent is not available. Is there a big brother? That's a social program that we have of people that will come and hang out with your kid.
Oh, right, yeah, okay. Not the TV show, right?
That's right. I was thinking, that's an interesting social reference.
Yeah.
Is there an aunt or an uncle? Is there somebody in your spiritual community? Is there somebody somewhere that can come and provide some connection for your child while you figure yourself out? And so we're taking the lens a little bit broader and looking for those opportunities to see if somebody can step in as surrogate while parent figures themselves out, or maybe parent won't ever figure it out. Right. And so then we're looking for longer term connection sources that can step in and be present.
And I think that's important to mention. Like if a parent actually can't develop the empathy that's required to transfer that to a child, then you mentioned surrogate. Like that's something we should seriously be considering for parents that perhaps either biologically or maybe even chemically don't, or just because they're so wounded and they're still doing their own work.
Yeah.
So surrogacy is something that is available to parents?
Well, I think in different
Empathetic
societies,
surrogacy?
it takes on varying forms.
Sure.
The reality is, as parents, period, we were never meant to go this alone.
Yeah.
Like there are reasons why historically we have existed in tribes and in villages. We were meant to be supported and championed in our role as parents. We had, advisors that gave us advice and imparted wisdom in terms of what we were doing as parents.
Yeah.
We had people that stepped in, and when we were tired or fatigued, like there were rituals and practices in place that made sure our cups were filled up so that as parents we could be our best selves as we grew our children up. And we parent in relative isolation today, by comparison.
By a long shot.
So if you think about that, and then you think about, a parent who's struggling, who there's, big wounds or other big things happening, we don't have these natural structures in place anymore, and so we have to backdoor them. And that's what I mean by finding the surrogate. Like, how do you backdoor that? How do you find the members of your village, your community, that can step forward and into that place of the source of connection for that child while the parent isn't able?
Nice, that's beautiful. I like the way you say forward. It's very unique. Did you notice? Yeah, it's nice. All right. What do you think are some of the challenges that parents are facing in modern society that perhaps our parents didn't face, that is new for us, and we're really having to work it out at a very big level?
Well, the isolation piece that we talked about, I think in bigger ways than ever before. I think that we are, generally speaking as a culture, quite frenzied in the way that we are approaching life. And I say that with broad sweeping brushstrokes. The demands on our time, the expectations in terms of the levels that we're meant to elevate to as far as performance at school, at work, are far greater than they've ever been before. So I think, as big picture pieces, those would certainly jump to mind. The other really significant piece is the technology revolution.
Glad you went there. I was about to go. Okay.
And that happened so quickly.
Yeah.
We did not have time to introduce cultural structures that were going to safeguard our children against the evils, if you were, that technology can bring to bear in their world and their lives. And so I think as parents now, in a big, fast way, we are having to figure that out and get on it and make sure we are safeguarding our children, that we are rewinding and getting back in there where we missed along the way. There is a very, very seedy underbelly, especially to the social media side of things. When we talk about being connection beings, we will always organize ourselves around our biggest needs. And so it is no surprise that social media has presented as significantly as it has. I had an article out in time.com a couple months ago about a group of Harvard students, incoming students, who were on this incoming students Facebook page and began to post all these horrifically inappropriate memes that were racially and sexually and otherwise flavored. And they were, their admissions to Harvard were revoked. So imagine you spend your whole life dreaming of being at Harvard and you just got kicked out. You never even got to step foot on campus. And the question was, how could this happen to our brightest, most promising kids? Because we organize ourselves around our greatest need. And in the world of social media, it has stepped in and gotten in the way of our attachment relationships, our truly fulfilling attachment relationships. It's like we're eating chocolate cake all day long, and we never want to sit down.
And the brain thinks it as well, like with the chemical releases that's going on.
And so then your parent steps forward and offers you some, steamed broccoli and glazed chicken, and you're like, ugh, no thanks.
It's interesting when we look at the early adopting Asian countries for technology and how they've got centres now that are overflowing, like with internet addiction treatment, gaming addiction treatment, and now even the advent of social media addiction treatment as well. And they're putting these kids into, essentially what looks like from the outside 12-step programs for, for digital purposes. So it really is impacting us in many ways.
Huge.
And I see this, digital parenting. It's like, how do I keep my kid entertained? But I've also seen the data that suggests the more, for every hour of screen time that a child has, it increases the probability of the potential for ADHD developing by what I would call a few percent. I can't remember the exact number, but I remember it was a few percent, which is significant.
It
wasn't
hugely
a fraction.
significant.
Yeah.
And if you think about what is screen time and gaming all about, it's a scan and search activity constantly.
Yeah.
How does that look in math class?
Yeah.
Not good.
Yeah.
Right? And in addition, it's a very stimulating activity. So when we look at it from the perspective of neuroplasticity, you're getting dysregulated constantly in those games. And you sit in a dysregulated state. Guess what your brain gets good at?
Dysregulating, yeah.
And which looks on the outside like challenges with attentional regulation.
Yeah, right. Okay. So how do we as parents then navigate, even co-parents that perhaps are like, holy shit, I'm lucky if I get 20 minutes a day to myself. I need to sit him down and put on Paw Patrol, or I need to pull the iPad at dinner just so I can have a moment of peace. Are there any, is it all bad, or is there a healthy dose that we can look at and a healthy prescription we can subscribe to?
Yeah. So the Canadian Pediatric Society and the comparative organization in the US have come together with a number of experts in that field to sort of script out some guidelines for what would be appropriate. The average child in Canada is spending somewhere between 7 to 10 hours a day being exposed to screens. And so what the expert guidelines are is that children under the age of 2, 0, including background television.
Wow.
And then I believe...
Babysitters all over the world rejoice. You're going to be getting more work.
And then from 3 to 6, I believe it's 30 minutes a day.
Right.
6 to 12, it increases to an hour or two in that stretch. That would be sort of safe screen exposure. And then over age 12, it's 2 hours. And then within that, they go into at what point does online gaming become safe and acceptable? At what point do violent games become safe and acceptable?
Is there an answer for those questions?
Yes, there is. And I'm pulling from memory. I feel like the online gaming is roughly around age 13, knowing that you have all your parental controls in place around that. And
what about gaming in general, like playing video games? Because I remember when I was a kid, it was like my mum sold it to me as it'll teach your brain how to develop faster in different ways. And we played these little tiny, black and white, 4 pixel things.
I believe it's the 6 to 12 age range
6 to 12,
where that starts to become something that we can be doing.
And the online 13 with parental controls in place.
That's right. And then violent gaming was 14, 15-ish range.
Right. Even that seems so young for
a
14-year-old.
Yes.
Susceptible, masculine, or even the feminine mind, hormones blasting.
Yes.
Learning how to regulate that in itself would be hard enough without experiencing violence.
Well, and then the other piece of it, in terms of what really is never actually is the highly, the sexualized gaming. A lot of it becomes quite pornographic. And so, it'll just never be okay. It's just, garbage in, garbage out.
Exactly.
So the more that you're flooding out the brain with that kind of messaging and that level of dysregulation, there will be repercussions.
You know what, that's a good kick in the butt for me as well, because with my son, when I'm home, I normally, in the new situation we have him, I'll have him anywhere between 3, in some cases 5 days a week. And I'm running multiple businesses, and I'm a busy guy like yourself, doing lots of different things. And in the mornings, the only way I can, well, it's not the only way, but I've just found a good default to go to, I'll wake up early, I'll meditate. Normally I'll get anywhere between half an hour to an hour before he wakes up, bring him into my bed, we'll roll around and play and cuddle. Then he'll get hungry and I'll take him out and I'll cook him something for breakfast. And then for me, it's almost like, okay, right, I'll put Paw Patrol on just so I can go and have a shower and just do my 22, because I've got a 22-minute routine to get ready in the morning, and just to do my routine in order to get back out. Which
not 23 minutes?
Well, sorry?
Not 23 minutes?
No, it's normally 22 minutes on the bang. I don't understand why people, because I wear almost the same thing every day. I know how to wash myself. I do it the same way every day. It's routine structures, right? So I know that's going to happen almost most mornings. if we're looking at 100 mornings that I have him, it's going to happen in probably 98 mornings where that happens. But then I find also there are other instances where he's like, oh, Dad, I want to... But he's the only kid, by the way, who will actually say, Dad, I've had enough. Well, the only kid. I'm sure there are other kids out there, but I've never heard other kids not want to watch TV, because there's been times before I've said to him, do you want to watch TV while Daddy does this? He goes, no, I want to be with you. So how as parents do we wrap our head... You know what? I'm actually going to go in a slightly different direction here. You know what? There's two questions here. First question is, how do we as parents modify our own needs and behaviours in order to meet the needs for the children when it comes to screen time? Because for a lot of parents, it's the baby. Like, I grew up, my babysitter was Channel 7. You know, so for me, it's a natural part of what I feel was my natural upbringing. How do we as parents like create a level of an understanding that we go, okay, he's only watching an hour and a half a day, he's only 3, what's the harm? Like, how do we rationalize this with enough impetus to go, okay, no, that's not okay. Like, what do we need to do to ourselves to actually move forward?
What time is it? Oh, I'm parked in a parking zone that expired at 3.
Is it close by?
Yes.
Can you tell Matthias what type of car you have and he can run down and feed the meter?
So I crashed my car on Sunday, so I have a rental car.
That's okay.
It might be towed already.
Oh no, don't say that.
Won't that be such a great story though?
So a question that actually came in on Snapchat was from a parent who said, are we allowed to have favourites?
So here's my answer. If you have a favourite, it means that you have one who's not a favourite. Where's that coming from?
Oh, that sounds polarised and judgmental. Yeah.
So what inside of you is judgmental? What parts of yourself are you judging harshly, unfairly, and why?
Wow. Good answer.
And also, there are certain human beings in this world that you as a human being will have a natural affinity to for whatever reason. And so let's just call that what it is. And know that when it comes to loving our children, they don't just want, but rather need our unconditional equilibrium
of love.
Yeah.
Yeah, I like that. So another one from Snapchat was, this was actually from an uncle. So he says, I don't have kids, but I have a niece, I think it was a niece or his sister's daughter, who I think was around 7, who seems to be always upset, always in a bit of a mood, and finds whenever someone wants to talk to her, she's annoyed about it. How do we talk to perhaps a 7 or 8-year-old who doesn't want to talk, and whenever someone tries to talk to them, they feel annoyed? This to me points to something bigger, but I'm curious what your perspective is.
I think you're right, that it points to something bigger, and that there's a shutting down in her, either because she has realized that in doing that, she actually gets more connection. So if she's crusty and irritated and pushing people away, then they begin to become seekers, and they'll be at her, and so she's getting the connection that she's seeking through those attention-seeking behaviors. The other thing is, I wonder if there's some kind of, in terms of how she connects with people. So I'll tell you like a completely different example, and then we'll come back to this question.
Yeah, sure.
For children who are on the autism spectrum, connecting through the visual, like eye to eye, is a really like it's incredibly intense and vulnerable. And so they'll avoid that channel of connection because it just is like really floods them out and overwhelms. But it's not that they're incapable of connecting. It's that they will find resonance in their connections with others via different channels. And so it might be movement, it might be touch, it might be sound, right? And so then I go back to this girl, this uncle that's asking the question about his niece, and I wonder, is there something for her that makes talking uncomfortable or looking into the whites of someone's eyes whilst talking uncomfortable? So much so that it has her kind of like going into some defensive detachment where she has to just preserve herself a little bit, which reads like irritation and annoyance, but might actually be an incredible vulnerability that's become too much for her to bear.
Or even like a hypersensory of sorts.
Yes. Yeah. And if you can think about hypersensory in terms of like what we traditionally think about sensory systems, and then add into that emotionally. So, for example, one of the psychologists in my clinic who works primarily with adolescents, also a mindfulness expert, she's a really, really interesting individual. The way her office is set up is that she wouldn't sit like this to speak with her adolescent clients. They're in a chair beside that's sort of turned.
Yeah.
And so it gives you like this little bit of distance because it's so intense to have to connect that way. And sometimes it just doesn't work for us. So maybe it's not working for her. Maybe there's another way that uncle can kind of figure out, really kind of makes sense to her in terms of how to connect.
One of the things that I've learned with Noah, and I'm not sure if this could be broader advice, is the language of children is play. And if we play in the things that they're interested in, then that in itself is a form of communication.
Yes.
But it also opens up, channels, different channels of communication and connection. And when they can see that we're engaged in, the things that they're interested in.
Yes. And joining with them and having the dance in that. And it's very, like when you're 3 or 4 or 5, or, I mean, truth be told, even 42, sometimes it's really hard to find the words to convey what's happening on the inside. And in the world of play and connecting with our children in ways that make sense to them, where they can actually access all sorts of other layers of themselves, they can more effectively communicate, and not always verbally, but sometimes verbally. And so finding, like, what is that? What is that for this uncle's niece? What is it for your son?
Yeah.
Right?
It did make me think of something else, which, I think is a great strategy for parents who are used to putting their kids in front of the screen, and we are going a little bit backwards, but this will move us forwards. How important is independent playtime for a developing child?
So I'm going to differentiate between independent playtime and connection time with parents.
Yes.
And so your children need you in whatever form you can sort of give of yourself through the course of the day. Having said that, you're not really, like, your role really isn't to entertain them. And I wrote a blog about a year and a bit ago on why you should do nothing when your child says he's bored.
Oh, I like where this is going because I've read some stuff. Okay.
And so basically I sort of talked about how it's so incredibly important to have space in our lives, particularly when we're children, where we can just be, and to see what comes out of that, and for there to be a lot of space for that, so that we connect with ourselves, we develop a sense of like our self-concept, who we are. Imagination. And so when I think about independent play, it takes me to that place of creating space in a child's world for them to just be. And one of the phrases that I used in that article was that children need the world to be quiet enough so that they can hear themselves.
Oh, wow.
And if you, like, imagine being 3 when you are poetry itself and you can hear yourself.
Oh, my God.
And that's your ongoing experience in childhood, what are you going to look like when you're 42?
Oh, my gosh. That was pretty deep. That hit me in my soul. One of the things I've observed with independent playtime, and I'm curious for your perspective on this, is what I've recognized is the importance for developing a healthy, strong, naturally long attention span. I was identified as ADHD when I was about 7. I'm starting to see the characteristics become very mild levels, because he'll be at jiu-jitsu. There'll be 14 kids lined up. 13 of them will be, looking straight forward, and one will be playing with his belt and looking around, and and that's my boy.
Yeah.
But what I find interesting, because at school I failed every single subject from year 1 all the way through to year 12, and I, now on reflection, identified through my own work that there was just nothing in school that interested me to capture my attention enough for me to put myself into it. And then when I discovered, like I think I read my first book when I was 23, and I was completely amazed that I could actually comprehend, not only complete the book, comprehend the book, but also retain the information that was from in the book. And so I slowly, as I started to build my intelligence, I realized that ADHD for me was actually a hypersensitivity to boredom. And I started to realize that it wasn't that I was learning disabled. I actually had an upgraded system, but I have to be sure to be learning the things that are of natural interest to me, otherwise they just won't click. And so what I've observed with Noah is almost the same thing playing out, but at a level of play where, it may appear that he is, easily distracted. But when he has his independent playtime and he sits down with his excavator and his trucks, he can literally focus on one thing, in some cases for 45 minutes, in some cases up to an hour, which, is incomprehensible as an attention span for most adults, let alone, a 3.5-year-old.
Yeah.
So do you think, apart from independence playtimes, quietening and them finding themselves, do you think it's also an important part of the development for them learning how to, maintain and practice, holding attention?
Sure. So we were talking about technology before, and the scan and search stimulating experience of being engaged in screen time. And so what your brain practices, it becomes naturally good at, right? So if your brain is getting practice with being quiet, if your brain is getting practice with sustained focus, if your brain is getting practice with the experience of mindfulness, these are then the processes that your brain becomes good at. And so I think independent play, boredom, letting kids sit in their own space and figure out who they are and what excites them, and watching where that goes and where it takes them. I mean, from a neuroplasticity perspective, it's important. Fantastic.
Beautiful. Well, I'm glad I checked the snaps, because we had a number of snaps that came through from people saying dealing with teenage moods. Like, how do we navigate and communicate with these hyper biological hormonal individuals who in themselves are still finding themselves, but how do we maintain connection but deal with the moods, but at the same time, coexist in a way that is healthy?
Yeah. So big thing for parents of adolescents to know that they may look pretty independent and in fact mimic sometimes young adults, where they're wandering around in these grown bodies and starting to drive cars and, all of these things that we expect of adults. But they are children. The period of adolescence in human development is an incredibly important period, and we must not retire too early from our role as parents. Your adolescent kids need you as much as your toddlers and preschoolers needed you. They're going through, the time of what is happening developmentally in that adolescent period in terms of self and in terms of brain is pretty profound. And so they need you more than ever. And because it's profound, it's noisy. It's going to get interesting.
Messy.
It's messy. There's this big pull to black and white thinking. Well, we're in this very egocentric stage of development. And so we're hot or we're cold. We're this or we're that. We're the light or the dark. There is no gray. There is no in between. And we go there like this. And it's just part of our brains are kind of turning themselves inside out. And lots of times we put it down to hormones, but really neurologically we're reorganizing so much that we just have to figure it out and make sense of it all. Our reward center is operating very intensely during that period, and so when drugs and alcohol, when we get a hit, it's a big hit. Right. It's not just the regular hit, it's big. Right. Because we're big. We're all black or all white, right? And so to know that the noisiness of the adolescent period is so normal and so healthy, and it means your kid is doing it exactly right. And for us to not get angsty about that and just to know that it's all playing out perfectly, that that's what it needs to be, that when they get loud and mad and angry and sad, they're really just regressed 3 or 4-year-olds in big bodies. And so how do you deal with that? Just as you would a 3 or 4-year-old, you be firm and kind, and you recognize that they are stretching one hand forward to the independence of adulthood while yearningly reaching one hand backwards to the dependence of childhood. And it's a tricky spot for them to be in. And so sometimes you'll need to sort of be the launching pad, and sometimes you'll need to provide safe harbor, and you're going to be constantly going back and forth, and it's all beautiful. It's just as it's meant to be.
So how do we as parents in that situation, when they appear to be so vulnerable, especially neurologically, or maybe that's not the right frame, but when it comes to them developing the right relationships with the right people, because I know from my own experience, developing the wrong relationship with the wrong kid at school at that age can be quite destructive. Sure. Especially when it comes down to being taken down paths of like drugs and alcohol and everything else. So how do we as parents navigate that without becoming so close that we could be labelled as a helicopter parent, of a teenage adult?
Sure. And so part of that is that you'll have already laid, in this very conscious way, a beautiful framework by the time your child reaches adolescence, that they'll have a very solid sense of self, even in the noise of the adolescent period, that they'll be able to capably decision make as they kind of trudge through this increasing independence and what that's all going to look like, and know when they need to sidestep some potential landmines. And so to sort of really parenting involves a lot of faith, and to have faith,
a lot of trust, yeah,
a lot of trust, and a lot of showing up. to know that if you've really sort of been putting in your time up to that point, that they're going to be okay, and be present and be available, because you must not retire too soon. But to have faith that this is going to play out and it's going to be fine. The other thing is that it comes down to relationships. And so as your children head off to middle and high school, with that is increasing levels of independence, and you don't always know who the friends are, how are you staying involved? In kindergarten, you drove them on all their field trips, and you had play dates with all the other parents, and you created this village kind of with all of those relationships. How are you doing that now that you've got a 14, 15, 16-year-old? Do you know other parents in your community of kids that they're hanging out with? Have you had them over for a meal? Do you volunteer on the school parent advisory council? Like, are you present in their lives? Are you around? Not necessarily, taking them to play dates. Yeah. But do you have a presence? And do they feel that presence? And in the context of all of those relationships, you're holding them close in a way that's developmentally appropriate for their stage of development.
Do you because you work in this field, do you hold yourself to an unreasonably high standard when it comes to parenting yourself?
I think as a human being, I hold myself to very high standards, and not always to good effect. Yeah. And so there's that part of it. And there is this, it's the seedy underbelly of being in this profession, that you can see. Yeah. You can see all of those things. And so I think, do I hold myself to a higher standard because I'm a child psychologist? I suppose so. But I'm also human. Yeah. And I mess it up all the time. And
I think that's where I'm kind of going. I think it's important for people to realize, and even if you're in the profession, you're still human, right?
Absolutely. And I work to find my innocence around all of that, and the innocence of my children's father and everything in the middle, and I atone for it.
Nice.
And find my way forward. We'll see what tomorrow looks like.
Another great question. This one came from Instagram. Came from a lady who said she separated from her husband about 18 months ago. And when the kids come back from being with their dad, they're often very emotional and very ungrounded.
Yes.
How to deal with that, and how to best help the kids regulate and ground when they come home from a situation like that?
First thing, which is a big ask, heal her relationship with their father.
Right.
Because if you can resolve the disconnection between yourselves as parents, you'll take care of a lot of the disconnect that is currently making those transitions so challenging for your children. And sometimes that's not possible. Maybe it's not possible right away to heal that relationship, or maybe there's other things getting in the way of that. How can you then bridge the divide? So remember our two steps. One was to minimize disconnect where we can minimize it, and the second was to bridge where we cannot minimize. Right. And so how are we bridging that? When the children are away for 5 or 6 days, how is she staying connected to them so that when they come home, they don't have such a big swing to do to get back into relationship with her? And so is there a way to FaceTime? Is there a way, if that's not possible, is there a way to have other connection rituals that are playing out? In the most extreme cases where none of those things will be possible, there's stories like the kissing hand, which is about the mama raccoon who puts the magic kisses on her little raccoon's hands that will never wash off. They're the magic kind of kisses that stay with you always, and whenever you need them, all you need to do is put your hand up on your face, and it's like I'm there giving you a kiss. And so There's all these rituals that you can put into place that even if the other parent isn't necessarily on board or things are kind of yucky for the time being, that you can work to bridge the gap, that you can have the invisible string, that you can have all of those pieces.
Kiss on the Hand, was that the book?
The Kissing Hand.
The Kissing Hand. Mm-hmm. I love that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's a beautiful story. Mm-hmm.
Okay, let's, there's a lot of people who would probably be listening to this who would, dare I say, be very busy, distracted. If there was one piece of advice that you could give the people listening and watching this at home that they could take in order to improve their relationship with their child, what would that be?
Have your child feel seen. It's what every single human being wants. And really see them. And it becomes limitless.
Okay, so my final question for you. And
I love this question. I saw it in the
Did you?
Yeah.
Did you get sent the questions?
I got sent, it went a little something like this. This is possibly what you might end up talking about, but it could go anywhere.
So my final question is, and we try to ask this to everyone, in your opinion, what does it mean to be superhuman? That's not the question you thought it was going to be, is it?
It's a version of the question I thought.
Okay, let me ask the version that I wanted to ask, because I thought you read this and I was like, now I don't want to disappoint you. In your opinion, what does it mean to be a superhuman parent?
I love that question.
Good. That was the question I wanted to ask.
So here's what I'll say. I think as human beings, souls walking around in our bodies, we get really tied to our stories. And we create all sorts of stories about our life and about our children's lives. But we're making it all up. None of it's real. It's all just a story. And if we could really connect with that as a reality, think about how profound that is. Think about the child that you think of as stubborn, the child that you think of as difficult, the child that you're so worried about that they're going to grow up to be this super angsty teenager that's never going to be able to handle the challenges of life. Think about those stories. And what if we could really connect with the idea that we're making it all up? None of it's real. And in the very best of all worlds, as a superhuman parent, if you could let go of the story and just allow the child's soulful being to present in whatever way it needs to for its own evolution, imagine how that would change your child's existence. And if you couldn't let go of the whole story, what if you could just tell yourself a different story, one with a happy ending? If all the parents in the land could do that for themselves and for their children, we would change the world. Right?
Absolutely.
We're making it all up.
Wow. I have to say, and I don't want to say I have favorites, but this has been one of my most favorite interviews so far by a long stretch. This has been fantastic. So, Dr. Vanessa Lapointe, how can people find out more about you? If they want to find out more about you, your book, what you do, your workshops, your services, how can they find you?
So, drvanessalapointe.com. I am also on Facebook and on Twitter at Dr. V. Lapointe.
Yes.
And my book is Discipline Without Damage, How to Get Your Kids to Behave Without Messing Them Up.
Wow, that's really cool. I'd love to stay connected.
That'd be wonderful.
Thank you so much for this interview. It has been absolutely fantastic. I can tell the change that you're doing in the world is clearly profound because it emanates from you and your energy is incredible. Thank you so much for being here.
Thank you. It's my pleasure.
You're welcome.
There you have it, guys. Thanks for tuning in to Unstoppable with me, your host, Kerwin Ray. And do me a favor, don't forget to drop me a review on iTunes. Would love to hear what you think. I love reading what you guys have to say. And your reviews make sure we keep creating killer content just like this. If you want to stay up to date with me and all my movements, please jump onto the website, kerwinray.com. And also check us out on social media at Kerwin Ray.